The carriage rattled hard over the frozen path, and Elowen Bramwell gripped the edge of her seat as if her life depended on it. Her heart pounded. In less than an hour, she would stand before a man she had never met and promise to be his wife forever. She did not know his voice. She did not know his face. She only knew his name, and the weight that name carried across the whole country. Duke Alaric Thornwood. The wheels struck a stone, and the carriage jolted so violently that Elowen's small bag slid off the seat. She caught it before it hit the floor, her fingers trembling. Outside the window, tall iron gates rose out of the mist like the teeth of some sleeping giant. Beyond them stood a house so large it seemed to swallow the horizon, its stone walls dark and unwelcoming under the gray morning sky. "We have arrived, my lady," the driver called out, his voice flat, as though he delivered brides to this gate every week. Elowen swallowed hard and stepped down from the carriage. Cold wind cut through her traveling cloak instantly. She pulled it tighter and looked up at the towering entrance of Thornwood Manor. Servants in black and gray uniforms stood in 2 straight lines, waiting for her, their faces polite but unreadable. Not one of them smiled. At the top of the stone steps, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes stood with her hands folded in front of her. This was Margaret, the head housekeeper, who had run the manor for over 20 years and had seen dukes come and go, brides arrive and disappear into silence. "Lady Bramwell," Margaret said, bowing slightly. "Welcome to Thornwood. His Grace is waiting in the East Hall." Elowen nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. She followed Margaret through the enormous front doors, her boots echoing against the marble floor. The inside of the house was even colder than the outside, despite the fires burning in every hearth. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every step. When they reached the East Hall, Margaret stopped and gestured toward a closed door. "He does not like to be kept waiting," she said quietly, almost like a warning. Elowen straightened her shoulders and pushed the door open herself. Inside, standing near a tall window with his back to her, was a man dressed entirely in black, his dark hair combed back neatly, his posture stiff as iron. When he turned, Elowen's breath caught, not because he was unkind to look at, for he was strikingly handsome, but because his eyes held absolutely nothing. No warmth, no curiosity, no welcome. "You are late," he said, his voice low and even. "The roads were difficult, Your Grace," Elowen answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I apologize." He studied her for a long moment, the way a merchant studies a horse before deciding whether to buy it. "You are smaller than I expected," he finally said. "No matter, this marriage was never about appearances." The words struck her harder than she wanted to admit. She had known, of course, that this union was arranged by her father and the Duke's late mother to combine 2 great estates and settle old debts between their families. She had known there would be no romance in it, not at first, but she had allowed herself to hope, quietly, secretly, that perhaps kindness could grow where love had not yet been planted. Standing before him now, she understood that hope had been foolish. "I am told the ceremony will take place this afternoon," Alaric continued, walking toward his desk without once looking back at her. "You will be given rooms in the West Wing. Margaret will show you where. I trust you understand the responsibilities that come with your new title." "I do, Your Grace." "Good." He sat down and picked up a letter from his desk, already dismissing her from his mind. "That will be all." Elowen stood frozen for a moment, waiting for something more, a question about her journey, a word of comfort, even simple curiosity about the woman he was about to marry. Nothing came. She turned and walked out of the room, her chest tight with a feeling she could not yet name. The wedding took place in the manor's private chapel that same afternoon, attended only by a handful of relatives and household staff. There was no music, no laughter, no joy in the air. Elowen wore a gown of pale blue silk that her mother had sewn with trembling hands weeks before, whispering blessings into every stitch. Alaric wore black, as he always did, and spoke his vows in the same flat tone he used for everything else. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alaric did not smile. He simply nodded, as though a business transaction had been completed successfully, and turned to accept congratulations from the small gathering of guests. That night, Elowen sat alone in her new chamber, staring at the fire crackling in the hearth. The room was beautiful, filled with fine furniture and soft blankets, everything a duchess could want. And yet it felt like a cage lined with silk. A soft knock came at her door. She rose quickly, smoothing her gown, her heart lifting, with a foolish hope that perhaps her husband had come to speak with her, to know her, to begin their life together properly. It was only Margaret. "His Grace asked me to inform you that he will not be joining you tonight," the housekeeper said, her tone carefully neutral. "He has matters to attend to." Elowen forced a small smile. "Of course. Thank you, Margaret." The older woman lingered for a moment, studying Elowen's face with something that looked almost like pity. "This house has seen many brides come through its doors, my lady," she said quietly. "Some found happiness here. Others did not. I hope, for your sake, you are among the fortunate ones." Before Elowen could ask what she meant, Margaret bowed and left, closing the door softly behind her. Alone again, Elowen walked to the window and looked out over the dark grounds of Thornwood Manor. Somewhere out there, beyond the gardens and the stone walls, was a world she barely understood, a world of titles and duty and cold arrangements. She pressed her hand against the glass, feeling its icy surface beneath her palm, and made herself a quiet promise. She would not beg for love. She would not chase a man who did not want her, but she would not disappear either. Whatever this marriage was meant to be, she intended to survive it with her dignity intact. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Elowen rose early each morning, dressed with the help of a young maid named Alice, and took her breakfast alone in the smaller dining room, since Alaric preferred to eat before dawn and disappear into his study for hours. She learned the layout of the enormous house slowly, wandering through long corridors and quiet libraries, discovering rooms filled with books nobody seemed to read, and portraits of ancestors nobody seemed to remember. She tried, in small ways, to reach her husband. She had meals prepared, according to dishes she heard he once enjoyed as a boy, information gathered carefully from the kitchen staff. She left a note on his desk one evening, asking gently about his day. She waited in the drawing room after dinner, hoping he might join her for even a few minutes of conversation. Alaric barely noticed any of it. He was polite, in the way a man is polite to a guest he does not particularly want in his house. He answered her questions with short, clipped responses. He thanked her for meals without truly tasting them. He nodded at her attempts at conversation, and then returned to whatever letter or ledger occupied his attention, as though she were nothing more than a pleasant piece of furniture recently added to his home. It was Margaret, in the end, who explained things more clearly, though she chose her words with great caution. One afternoon, as Elowen sat in the garden trying to read a book she could not concentrate on, Margaret approached with a tray of tea, setting it down on the small stone table beside her. "You seem troubled, my lady," Margaret said gently. Elowen closed her book. "Is it so obvious?" To an old woman who has watched too many young brides sit in this same garden. "Yes." Margaret poured the tea slowly. "You are trying to win a heart that has already been given elsewhere." Elowen's hands tightened around her cup. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the manor, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "There was a woman, before you came, Lady Vivian Ashcombe. His Grace cared for her deeply, long before this marriage was arranged. When his mother insisted upon this union with your family, for reasons of debt and duty, he had no choice but to obey. But choosing you as a wife did not mean he chose to stop caring for her." The words settled over Elowen like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of understanding through everything she had witnessed since arriving at Thornwood. The distance, the coldness, the way his eyes looked through her rather than at her. Does he still see her?" Elowen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's silence was answer enough. "I should not have said so much," the housekeeper murmured, rising quickly. "Forgive me, my lady. Please forget my words." But Elowen could not forget them, not that night, not the next, not for many nights after. She began to notice things she had overlooked before, small clues scattered across her husband's careful, guarded life. A locket he sometimes touched absent-mindedly beneath his coat, quickly hidden if he realized he was being watched. Evenings when he left the manor without explanation, returning hours later smelling faintly of a perfume that was certainly not her own. Letters that arrived addressed in delicate, flowing handwriting, which he read alone in his study, with the door firmly locked, and which she never saw again afterward, as though they had been burned in the fireplace. Elowen said nothing at first. She told herself she was imagining things, building suspicion out of loneliness and idle gossip. She reminded herself that theirs was an arranged marriage, that affection was never promised, only duty and respect. Perhaps, she thought, if she remained patient and kind, her husband's heart might slowly soften toward her, the way frozen ground eventually gives way to spring. But as weeks turned into months, that hope grew thinner and thinner, like ice stretched too far across a pond, cracking quietly beneath the weight of things left unspoken. One evening, returning from a walk in the eastern gardens, where the last roses of the season still clung stubbornly to their branches, Elowen noticed lantern light flickering from the old guest cottage near the edge of the property, a small stone building rarely used, meant for visiting relatives who almost never came. Curious, and perhaps foolishly hopeful that she might finally understand her husband better, she walked closer. Through the narrow window, she saw him. Alaric sat across from a woman with golden hair and a soft, familiar smile, the kind of smile Elowen had never once seen directed toward herself. The woman reached across the small table and touched his hand, and Alaric did not pull away. Elowen stood frozen in the darkness outside, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and heartbreak. She did not need Margaret's careful whispers anymore to understand the truth. She was seeing it now with her own eyes, plain and undeniable. She turned and walked back toward the manor slowly, her steps steady, despite the storm raging inside her chest. She would not cry, not tonight, not where anyone might see. She had promised herself, on her very first night in this house, that she would not beg for love that was never hers to have. But watching that lantern light flicker behind her, Elowen understood that her marriage, whatever gentle hope she had carried into it, had just become something far more difficult, a quiet struggle between duty and truth, one she had not yet decided how she intended to face. As she reached the tall doors of Thornwood Manor, she paused only once, looking back at the small cottage glowing faintly in the darkness. Whatever happened next, she knew with sudden and startling clarity, would change everything. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her grand bed, with its silk sheets and its carved wooden posts, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the scene at the cottage, over and over in her mind. She thought of her mother's hands sewing her wedding gown, of the hopeful words her mother had whispered while stitching, that love could grow slowly, like a seed planted in cold soil. She thought of her father's proud smile as he sent her off to become a duchess, believing he had secured her future. None of them had known what waited for her behind these stone walls. By morning, Elowen had made a decision. She would not confront her husband in anger, not yet. She would watch, and she would learn, and she would decide for herself what kind of woman she intended to become inside this marriage. She rose before dawn, dressed simply, and walked down to the kitchens, where the cooks were already preparing the day's meals. A young kitchen maid named Nora greeted her with a curtsy, clearly surprised to see the new duchess awake so early. "My lady, is something wrong? Shall I fetch Margaret?" "No, Nora, thank you," Elowen said, offering a gentle smile despite the ache in her chest. "I simply could not sleep. I thought I might help prepare breakfast, if you will allow it." Nora glanced nervously toward the head cook, an older woman named Beatrice, who ruled the kitchen with quiet authority. Beatrice studied Elowen for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There is bread that needs kneading, my lady, if you do not mind getting flour on your hands." "I do not mind at all." For the next hour, Elowen worked alongside the kitchen staff, kneading dough and stirring pots, finding a strange comfort in the simple, honest labor. It was nothing like the cold formality of the manor's upper halls. Here, among flour and firewood and the warm smell of baking bread, she felt, for the first time since arriving at Thornwood, something close to peace. Beatrice watched her carefully as she worked. "You are not what I expected, my lady," the older woman finally said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more delicate. Someone who would sit in her rooms all day, complaining about the cold and ringing bells for servants." Beatrice allowed herself a small, rare smile. "You surprise me. That is not a bad thing." Elowen returned the smile, grateful for even this small kindness. "I was raised on a smaller estate, not nearly as grand as this one. My mother believed a lady should know how to work with her own hands, not just give orders to others. A wise woman, your mother. As the morning wore on, Elowen learned more about the household from the kitchen staff than she had learned from anyone else since arriving. She learned that Alaric's mother, the late Duchess, had been a stern and demanding woman who ruled the household with an iron will, and that her death 2 years earlier had left Alaric colder and more withdrawn than ever. She learned that Vivian Ashcombe had been a frequent visitor to the estate long before Elowen's arrival, though always in secret, always through the side gardens where fewer eyes might notice her carriage. She learned, too, that the staff pitied her, though none said so directly. She could see it in the careful way they avoided certain topics, in the sympathetic glances exchanged between Nora and Beatrice whenever her husband's name arose in conversation. Later that day, Elowen encountered Alaric in the long gallery that connected the east and west wings of the manor. He was walking briskly, clearly on his way somewhere important, and barely slowed his pace when he saw her. "Elowen," he said, using her name for perhaps the third time since her arrival. "I trust you are settling in well." "I am, Your Grace," she answered, matching his measured tone. "Though I confess, I would welcome the chance to know more about the man I have married." Something flickered across his face, so brief she almost missed it. A shadow of discomfort, quickly smoothed away beneath his usual composure. "There will be time for that," he said. "Marriage is not built in a single conversation." "No," she agreed quietly, "but it is not built in silence either." He studied her for a moment longer than usual, as though seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival. Then, without another word, he continued on his way, his footsteps echoing down the long gallery until they faded into silence. Elowen stood alone for a long moment, watching the empty space where he had been. She thought again of the cottage, of the golden-haired woman, and the gentle touch upon her husband's hand. She thought of Margaret's careful warning, and of the quiet pity in the eyes of the kitchen staff. Whatever love this marriage might one day hold, she understood now that she would have to fight for it, patiently and carefully, without losing herself in the process. And if that love never came, she resolved silently, she would still walk out of this house one day, with her head held high, unbroken by a man who could not see her worth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the tall windows of Thornwood Manor, as though the old house itself sensed the storm quietly gathering within its walls. Autumn gave way to winter, and the halls of Thornwood Manor grew colder in more ways than one. Elowen had stopped waiting for her husband's footsteps in the evening. She had stopped setting a second place beside her own at the small dining table, tired of watching the food grow cold while she ate alone. She had not stopped noticing, though. If anything, she noticed everything now, with the sharp clarity of a woman who had trained herself to survive on careful observation. The locket beneath his coat, the lavender scent that clung faintly to his clothes some evenings, the letters that arrived in flowing, delicate handwriting and vanished into the fireplace before morning. She catalogued each detail quietly, the way a soldier studies the movements of an enemy camp, though she hated herself a little for thinking of her own husband in such terms. One gray morning, while walking through the manor's library in search of a book to occupy her restless mind, Elowen found a folded letter tucked carelessly between the pages of an old poetry collection. Her fingers hesitated over it for only a moment, before curiosity overpowered her better judgment. She unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same delicate script she had seen on countless envelopes delivered to her husband's study. The letter was brief, but its words struck her like a physical blow. "My dearest Alaric, the nights grow long without you. I count the days until you find an excuse to visit again. She may wear your name, but you and I both know where your heart truly belongs. Yours always, Vivienne." Elowen stood frozen, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. She had suspected, of course. Margaret's careful warning, the cottage window, the golden-haired woman's gentle touch upon her husband's hand. She had suspected all of it, but suspicion and confirmation were two very different burdens to carry, and the weight of the second nearly buckled her knees. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her gown, her mind racing. She could confront him immediately, demand answers, insist upon the truth. Or she could wait, gather more evidence, understand the full shape of the betrayal, before deciding how best to respond. In the end, Her pride made the decision for her. That evening, Elowen waited in her husband's study, seated calmly in the leather chair across from his desk, the letter resting on the polished wood between them like a silent accusation. When Alaric entered the room and saw her there, his expression flickered with surprise, quickly replaced by his usual careful composure. "Elowen, I did not expect you here." "I imagine not," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She gestured toward the letter. "I found this in the library. I believe it belongs to you." Alaric's eyes moved to the folded paper, and for the first time since their marriage began, Elowen watched something crack behind his carefully guarded expression. He crossed the room slowly and picked up the letter, reading it once, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Where did you find this?" "Does it matter? The words are quite clear, Your Grace. I do not think there is much room for misunderstanding." He set the letter down carefully, avoiding her gaze. "Elowen, this marriage was arranged for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. You know this. My mother and your father negotiated the terms long before either of us had any say in the matter. I am aware of how this marriage came to be," Elowen said, her voice rising slightly, despite her effort to remain calm. "I never expected love to bloom overnight between strangers. But I did expect honesty. I did expect basic respect. Instead, I find letters from another woman hidden in your library, and I hear whispers from your own household staff about visits to a cottage where you meet her in secret." Alaric's head snapped up at that, his eyes narrowing. "You have been watching me. I have been trying to understand my own husband, since he offers me nothing willingly." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Finally, Alaric sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, a rare gesture of frustration from a man who prided himself on perfect composure. "Vivian and I were together for 3 years before my mother arranged this marriage," he said quietly. "I loved her. I still do, if I am honest with you, though I know that honesty brings you pain rather than comfort. My mother believed her family's status was not sufficient for a duke's wife. She insisted upon a union with your family instead, for reasons of debt and political advantage that had nothing to do with my own wishes. And so you married me," Elowen said, "while your heart remained with her." "Yes." The word fell between them, like a stone, dropped into deep water, sending ripples of finality through the room. Elowen felt something inside her chest crack open, though she refused to let the tears gathering behind her eyes fall in front of him. "Then what am I to you, Alaric? A convenient arrangement? A necessary duty to be tolerated, while your true affection lies elsewhere?" "I did not choose this situation," he said, his voice quieter now, "any more than you did." "No," she agreed. "But you continue to choose it every single day, every time you meet her in secret, every time you read her letters and burn them, so I will not see, every time you touch that locket beneath your coat, as though it were more precious than the vows we spoke before a priest." She rose from the chair, her hands trembling slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "I did not ask for a great romance, Alaric. I asked only for respect. You have given me neither." Alaric's expression hardened, old pride rising to defend against the accusation. "You forget your place, Elowen. I am the Duke of this estate, and you would do well to remember the respect owed to that title, regardless of what passes between myself and matters that do not concern you." "Do not concern me?" Elowen's voice trembled with disbelief. "I am your wife. Your choices concern me deeply, whether you wish them to or not." "Enough." His voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp and final. "I will not be questioned in my own study, in my own home, by a woman whose only claim to this house comes from an arrangement neither of us requested. You will conduct yourself with the dignity expected of a duchess, and you will leave matters of my personal affairs to my own judgment." Elowen stared at him, stunned by the sudden coldness in his voice, a coldness she had not expected even after everything she had already witnessed. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that confronting him directly might open some door toward honesty, toward at least the possibility of mutual respect if not affection. Instead, she found only a wall higher and colder than before. "Very well, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I will trouble you no further with questions about your personal affairs. but do not expect warmth from a wife you have chosen to shame in her own home." She turned and walked toward the door, her back straight, her steps measured, despite the storm raging inside her chest. Just as her hand reached the handle, Alaric's voice stopped her. "Elowen." She paused but did not turn around. "I did not intend for you to suffer in this arrangement," he said, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "Circumstances beyond my control shaped this marriage long before either of us had any say in the matter." "Perhaps not," Elowen replied softly, still facing the door. "But you have had every choice in how you treat me since, and you have chosen coldness over kindness, secrecy over honesty, at every opportunity." She opened the door and stepped through it without waiting for his response, closing it quietly behind her. She did not cry until she reached her own chamber, and even then, she allowed herself only a few moments of quiet grief, before wiping her eyes and steadying her breath. She would not let this marriage break her, whatever cruelty it demanded of her in the days ahead. Word of the confrontation spread through the household with surprising speed, despite neither Elowen nor Alaric speaking of it openly. Servants exchanged glances more carefully now when the Duke and Duchess crossed paths in the hallways. Margaret's expression grew more sympathetic each time she attended to Elowen's needs, though she said nothing further about Vivian Ashcombe, having already learned the danger of speaking too freely. Elowen noticed, too, that Alaric's visits to the old cottage grew bolder rather than more discreet, as though her confrontation had removed whatever small caution he had previously maintained. He no longer bothered disguising his absences with vague excuses about estate business. He simply left, some evenings, without explanation, returning hours later with that same faint scent of lavender clinging to his coat. Elowen endured it with quiet dignity, refusing to give the household staff further reason for gossip, refusing to give her husband the satisfaction of seeing her weakened by his behavior. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The careful hope she had carried into this marriage, however small it had been, had died completely in that study, replaced by a hardened resolve to survive, with whatever dignity remained available to her. One evening, as she sat alone in the drawing room, working at a piece of embroidery she barely paid attention to, Margaret entered quietly and settled into the chair across from her. "You are troubled, my lady," the housekeeper observed gently. "I am managing," Elowen replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Margaret studied her for a long moment. "This house has survived worse storms than this one, my lady, though I confess I have never seen the master quite so reckless in his indiscretion. Something has changed in him since your confrontation, though I could not say whether for better or worse." "Worse, I think," Elowen said quietly. "Much worse." Margaret reached across and patted her hand gently, an unusual gesture of comfort from a woman normally so composed. "Whatever comes, my lady, know that there are those within these walls who admire your strength, even if the master himself fails to recognize it." Elowen offered a small, grateful smile, though the weight in her chest remained heavy. Outside, winter winds howled against the tall windows of Thornwood Manor, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the gardens, lantern light flickered faintly from the direction of the old stone cottage, a quiet, persistent reminder of the battle Elowen now understood she would have to fight alone. A few days later, a letter arrived from her mother, asking gently how married life suited her new daughter, whether the Duke treated her with kindness, whether the great house had grown warmer with time. Elowen sat at her writing desk for nearly an hour, pen hovering over the paper, unable to decide what truth she dared to share. In the end, she wrote only pleasant, careful sentences, describing the beauty of the gardens and the elegance of the manor, saying nothing of locked studies, secret cottages, or letters signed with another woman's name. She could not bear to worry her mother with troubles that had no easy solution, and some stubborn part of her still refused to admit defeat so early into her marriage. She sealed the letter and handed it to a footman for delivery, then sat by her window watching the carriage disappear down the long drive, carrying with it the last piece of honest connection she still had to the life she had left behind. That same week, Elowen was invited, along with her husband, to a gathering hosted by Lord and Lady Ellery, close neighbors whose estate bordered Thornwood's northern fields. Such invitations were common among the nobility of the county, evenings of polite conversation, fine food, and careful gossip disguised as friendly chatter. Elowen had attended only a handful of such gatherings since her marriage, always at Alaric's side, always playing the role of a contented duchess for the benefit of watching eyes. This particular evening proved more difficult than most. Among the guests seated at the long dining table was Lady Charlotte Winslow, a sharp-tongued woman, known throughout the county for her fondness for gossip and her lack of discretion in sharing it. "Tell me, Duchess," Charlotte said during a lull in conversation, her eyes glittering with poorly hidden curiosity. "How do you find life at Thornwood? I hear the estate keeps quite busy with visitors these days." Elowen felt Alaric stiffen slightly beside her, though his expression remained perfectly composed. "Thornwood is a large estate, Lady Winslow. There is always business to attend to." Of course," Charlotte continued, clearly enjoying herself. "Though I understand some of that business takes place rather late in the evening, at the old cottage near the eastern boundary. My cousin's groundskeeper mentioned seeing lantern light there quite often, even on the coldest nights." A heavy silence fell over that section of the table. Elowen felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, though she forced herself to maintain a calm expression, refusing to give the gathered guests the satisfaction of watching her crumble. Beside her, Alaric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing to defend either himself or his wife. "The groundskeepers have many duties that require attention at unusual hours," Elowen said finally, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt beneath her carefully composed exterior. "I find it best not to trouble myself with every detail of estate management, Lady Winslow. Perhaps you might find more productive uses for your own evenings than counting lanterns on properties that are not your own." A few quiet chuckles rippled around the table at her sharp response, and Charlotte's smile faltered slightly, clearly unaccustomed to having her gossip turned back upon her so gracefully. Alaric glanced at his wife with something that might have been surprise, though he quickly returned his attention to his plate, saying nothing further on the matter. The rest of the evening passed with careful, guarded conversation, though Elowen felt the weight of curious glances following her throughout the remainder of the gathering. By the time their carriage finally pulled away from the Ellery estate, she was exhausted, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack beneath the strain of performing contentment she did not feel. "You handled Lady Winslow well," Alaric said quietly, as the carriage rattled along the dark road back toward Thornwood, the first words he had spoken to her directly since their argument in his study weeks earlier. "I have had practice defending myself, Your Grace," Elowen replied, staring out the window rather than meeting his eyes, "since I received so little defense from my own husband." Alaric fell silent at that, and neither of them spoke again for the remainder of the journey home. But Elowen noticed, in the dim light of the carriage lamp, something troubled crossing his features. A flicker of doubt, perhaps, or discomfort, quickly suppressed beneath his usual careful composure. Whatever small crack had appeared in his armor that evening closed quickly in the days that followed. If anything, Alaric grew more distant, more short-tempered, as though the gossip now circulating through the county's noble houses embarrassed him more than any private confrontation with his wife ever had. He began spending even longer hours away from the manor, his absences stretching from evenings into entire days, his excuses growing thinner and less convincing with each passing week. Elowen, for her part, retreated further into the quiet rhythms she had built for herself within the household, finding comfort in the kitchen, with Beatrice and Nora, in long walks through the gardens despite the biting cold, in letters to her mother that grew increasingly careful in what truths they omitted. She told herself she was surviving, that endurance itself was a kind of quiet victory, but some nights, alone in her grand chamber, with its silk sheets and carved wooden posts, she allowed herself to wonder how much longer she could endure a marriage built entirely upon absence and secrecy, before something within her finally broke beyond repair. She did not yet know that the true breaking point still waited ahead of her, closer than she imagined, gathering slowly like storm clouds above the towers of Thornwood Manor. Snow had begun to fall steadily over Thornwood by the time Elowen decided she could no longer live inside the fragile silence that had settled over her marriage. Weeks had passed since the dinner at the Ellery estate, and though no further public embarrassment had occurred, the private distance between husband and wife had only widened, cold and unyielding as the frozen ground outside. Elowen had spent many quiet hours turning the matter over in her mind, weighing patience against pride, hope against dignity. She had tried gentleness, and it had gone unnoticed. She had tried confrontation, and it had earned her only anger and colder silence. Now, she decided, it was time to demand clarity, whatever the cost. She found Alaric in his study late one evening, bent over ledgers by candlelight, his dark hair falling slightly across his forehead, in a way that might have seemed boyish on a kinder man. He glanced up when she entered, his expression guarded immediately, as though bracing for another difficult conversation. "Elowen, it is late." "It is," she agreed, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. "But I find myself unable to sleep, Your Grace, until certain matters are settled between us." He set down his pen slowly, folding his hands atop the desk. "What matters?" "I want to know what you intend for this marriage." Elowen's voice remained steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "I have tried patience. I have tried honesty. Neither has earned me anything but your continued absence, and the humiliation of hearing gossip about my own husband's affairs from strangers at a dinner table. I will not continue living this way, Alaric, uncertain and disrespected in my own home." Alaric's expression hardened slightly, though something uncertain flickered behind his dark eyes. "What would you have me do?" "Choose," Elowen said simply. "Choose between the vows you spoke before a priest and the woman who occupies your heart despite them. I do not ask you to love me, Alaric. I understand that love cannot be commanded into existence, but I ask you to decide, honestly and finally, what role I am meant to play in this house. Am I your wife, deserving of respect and honesty? Or am I merely an obligation you tolerate, while your true affections remain elsewhere?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Alaric rose from his desk and walked to the window, staring out at the snow falling silently over the dark gardens below. "You ask a difficult question," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I ask a fair one." He turned to face her, and for a moment, Elowen thought she saw genuine conflict behind his careful composure, a battle between duty and desire that had clearly troubled him long before her arrival at Thornwood. "Vivienne and I share a history that predates this marriage by many years," he said slowly. "I cannot simply erase feelings that have existed since before I ever knew your name. But I also recognize the vows I made and the responsibility that comes with the title I carry." "Recognition is not the same as action," Elowen replied. "You recognize your vows, and yet you continue meeting her in secret. You recognize my position as your wife, and yet you offer me nothing but cold civility, while reserving warmth for another." Alaric's jaw tightened, old pride rising once more to defend against her accusation. "You forget yourself, Elowen. I have given you everything a duchess requires, a title, a home, security, and comfort beyond what most women could ever hope to enjoy." "You have given me a house," Elowen said, her voice trembling now with barely contained emotion. "You have given me a title, but you have given me nothing of yourself, Alaric, not your time, not your honesty, not even the basic courtesy of ending things properly, with a woman who continues to write you letters claiming your heart belongs to her, rather than to your own wife." "Enough," Alaric said sharply, his composure finally cracking under the weight of her words. "I will not be lectured on honesty by a woman who married me, for the very title and security she now claims means nothing to her." The accusation struck Elowen like a physical blow. "I did not choose this marriage, any more than you did," she said, her voice shaking with anger now, rather than sorrow. "My father arranged it, just as your mother arranged it for you. I came to this house hoping, foolishly perhaps, that two strangers bound by duty might find some measure of kindness between them. Instead, I have found only coldness, secrecy, and now, apparently, blame for circumstances entirely beyond my control." Alaric ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his tense posture. "What would you have me say, Elowen? That I regret this marriage? That I wish circumstances had allowed me to choose differently?" "I would have you say the truth," she replied quietly, some of her earlier anger draining away into simple exhaustion. "Whatever that truth might be." For a long moment, Alaric said nothing, staring at her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something caught between guilt and frustration, and a reluctant, buried respect for the strength she continued to display, despite everything he had put her through. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "The truth is that I do not know how to give you what you deserve, Elowen. I do not know how to simply set aside feelings that have existed for years, regardless of what duty demands of me now. I am not proud of the pain this has caused you. But I am also not prepared to pretend affection I do not yet feel, simply to satisfy appearances. Elowen absorbed his words slowly, feeling something within her settle into quiet, resigned understanding. "Then we understand each other clearly, at last," she said softly. "You will not choose me, not truly, whatever vows we spoke before that priest, and I will not continue pretending contentment in a marriage built entirely upon absence and secrecy. What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting nothing, Your Grace, beyond honesty between us going forward. I will continue fulfilling my duties as your Duchess, managing this household with whatever dignity remains available to me, but do not expect warmth from me any longer, nor patience with your continued visits to that cottage. I have given both freely, and both have been wasted." She turned to leave, but Alaric's voice stopped her at the door, quieter now, almost uncertain. "Elowen." She paused, but did not turn around, much as she had done weeks earlier, after their first confrontation in this same study. "I did not intend for things between us to grow this difficult," he said. "Intentions matter little, Alaric, when actions tell such a different story." She opened the door and stepped through it, closing it quietly behind her, leaving him alone, with whatever thoughts troubled his careful composure. In the weeks that followed, an uneasy truce settled over the household, cold but stable, like ice covering a pond that both husband and wife understood could crack at any moment beneath sufficient pressure. Elowen threw herself into managing the estate's affairs with renewed determination, finding purpose in tasks that had nothing to do with her marriage's quiet failures. She reorganized the household accounts with Margaret's assistance, improved conditions for the estate's tenant farmers after touring their modest homes personally, and began teaching Nora and Alice to read properly, finding satisfaction in small acts of genuine kindness that her own marriage seemed unable to provide her. Alaric, meanwhile, continued his visits to the cottage, though he no longer bothered attempting discretion, as though their conversation had removed whatever small caution had previously restrained him. The household staff whispered among themselves whenever his absences stretched particularly long, though none dared speak openly to their mistress about matters that clearly caused her private pain. One afternoon, while overseeing repairs to a section of fencing near the estate's eastern boundary, Elowen encountered Vivian Ashcombe, directly for the first time since her arrival at Thornwood. The golden-haired woman was walking near the cottage, clearly unaware that Elowen had chosen that particular path for her afternoon inspection of the grounds. The two women stood facing each other for a long, tense moment, neither quite certain how to proceed. Vivian recovered first, offering a polite, careful smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Duchess," she said, inclining her head slightly. "I did not expect to encounter you here." "Nor I you," Elowen replied evenly, studying the woman who had occupied so much of her private anguish these past months. Up close, Vivian was younger than Elowen had expected, perhaps only a year or two older than herself, with delicate features and an air of practiced elegance that suggested considerable experience navigating difficult social situations. "I imagine this meeting is uncomfortable for us both," Vivian said finally, her tone surprisingly direct, "though I suspect we understand each other's positions better than most would assume." "Do we?" Elowen's voice carried a sharper edge than she intended. "I confess I struggle to understand a woman who continues pursuing a married man, regardless of whatever history exists between them." Something flickered across Vivian's expression, quickly masked beneath careful composure. "Alaric and I shared a bond long before this marriage was arranged, Duchess. I do not expect you to understand or forgive that history, but know that I take no particular pleasure in the pain this situation causes you. And yet you continue accepting his visits," Elowen replied. "You continue writing him letters that speak of his heart belonging to you, rather than to his own wife. Whatever pain you claim to regret, you do little to prevent its continuation." Vivian's composure cracked slightly at that, something almost vulnerable flickering behind her carefully maintained elegance. "Perhaps you are right, Duchess. Perhaps I am selfish in continuing what should have ended long ago. But I would ask you to consider this, before you judge me too harshly. I did not arrange this marriage, any more than you did. I loved Alaric long before his mother decided his future required a different path. Whatever fault you find in my continued presence, remember that I too am navigating circumstances I did not choose." Elowen studied the other woman carefully, surprised by the unexpected honesty in her words. "Perhaps we are both trapped by circumstances neither of us chose," she said finally, her anger softening slightly despite herself. But trapped or not, Lady Ashcombe, I am his wife, and I would ask that you consider, going forward, whether continuing this arrangement serves either of our best interests, or merely prolongs suffering for everyone involved, including yourself." Vivian said nothing further, though something thoughtful crossed her expression as Elowen turned and continued along her path, leaving the golden-haired woman standing alone near the small stone cottage that had caused so much private anguish within Thornwood's walls. That evening, Elowen sat by her window long after the household had settled into sleep, watching snow fall silently over the dark gardens below. She did not yet know that her conversation with Vivian, however civil, would soon reach her husband's ears through careful household gossip, nor did she know how dramatically the fragile truce between them was about to shatter. Word reached Alaric only 2 days later, delivered without malice by a young groundskeeper named Edmund, who mentioned in passing to another servant that he had seen the Duchess speaking with Lady Ashcombe near the eastern fence, unaware that Alaric himself stood within earshot, reviewing repair estimates nearby. The moment the words left Edmund's mouth, Alaric's expression darkened, and he said nothing further to the young man, though his mind churned with questions throughout the remainder of the afternoon. That evening, he sought Elowen out in the drawing room, where she sat quietly working at her embroidery beside the fire. "I understand you spoke with Vivian," he said, without preamble, his tone carefully controlled despite the tension evident in his shoulders. Elowen set down her needlework, meeting his gaze steadily. "I encountered her near the eastern boundary. Yes, quite by accident. We exchanged a few words, nothing more." "What words?" "Honest ones," Elowen replied. "I told her that I understood. Neither of us chose the circumstances we find ourselves within, but that continuing this arrangement serves no one, least of all herself." Alaric's jaw tightened. "You had no right to speak to her on such matters." "I had every right," Elowen said, rising from her chair, her earlier resolve hardening once more into quiet determination. "I am your wife, Alaric, whatever role you continue reducing me to in your own mind. If I encounter the woman who occupies my husband's heart while I occupy only his house, I believe I am entitled to speak honestly with her about the situation we all three find ourselves trapped within." "You embarrass me," Alaric said, his voice rising slightly despite his usual composure. "Approaching her directly, discussing private matters, as though you have some claim to interfere in affairs that predate your arrival in this family entirely." "I embarrass you?" Elowen's voice trembled with disbelief at the unfairness of his accusation. "You embarrass yourself, Alaric, every time you visit that cottage, every time household staff whisper about lantern light burning late into the evening, every time gossip about your affairs reaches the dinner tables of our neighbors before it reaches honest conversation between husband and wife. I have done nothing this evening except speak plainly to a woman who has caused me considerable private pain, and I did so with far more grace than you have shown me since the day I arrived at Thornwood." Alaric said nothing for a long moment, clearly struggling against the truth in her words, though old pride refused to allow him to admit it openly. Finally, he turned and left the drawing room, without further argument, his footsteps echoing sharply down the corridor, leaving Elowen alone once more with the quiet crackling of the fire and the heavy weight of another conversation that had resolved nothing between them. She did not know, as she sat back down and resumed her embroidery with trembling hands, that an invitation had arrived that very morning for a grand winter ball to be hosted at Thornwood Manor itself, an event that would soon force husband and wife together before the watching eyes of the entire county's nobility, with consequences neither of them could yet imagine. Margaret brought her the news the following morning, arriving with a stack of correspondence and a guest list that had already grown to include nearly every notable family within a day's travel of the estate. "His Grace has decided to host the annual winter gathering this year," Margaret explained, setting the papers carefully on the writing desk. "It has been 3 years since Thornwood held such an event, not since the old Duchess passed. I imagine he wishes to reassert the family's standing among the county's nobility." Elowen studied the guest list with a growing sense of unease. Nearly 200 names filled the pages, families she had met only briefly at smaller gatherings, along with several she recognized as particularly fond of gossip, Lady Winslow chief among them. "This will require considerable preparation," she said carefully. "It will, my lady." and I imagine His Grace will expect you to oversee much of it, as befits your position as Duchess." Elowen nodded slowly, already calculating the enormous effort such an event would require. The menus and decorations, the musicians and seating arrangements, the countless small details that would determine whether Thornwood's reputation emerged from the evening enhanced or diminished. Despite everything that had passed between herself and her husband these past months, she found herself grateful for the distraction such preparations would provide, a chance to focus her energy on something productive rather than dwelling endlessly on the quiet failures of her marriage. She could not have known, as she began organizing menus with Beatrice and reviewing decoration schemes with Margaret over the following days, that this very ball, meant to showcase Thornwood's grandeur before the watching eyes of the county, would instead become the setting for the most painful and public humiliation of her entire life. The night of the winter ball arrived wrapped in a beauty that felt almost cruel given the tension simmering beneath Thornwood's polished surface. Every chandelier in the great hall blazed with candlelight, their reflections dancing across polished marble floors that had been scrubbed until they gleamed like still water. Garlands of evergreen and white winter roses decorated the columns, filling the air with a fresh, cold fragrance that mingled with the scent of roasted meats and warm spiced wine drifting from the banquet tables. Elowen stood before her mirror as Alice fastened the final clasps of her gown, a deep emerald silk that Margaret had insisted would complement her dark hair beautifully. She studied her reflection carefully, searching for some sign of the anxiety twisting in her stomach, relieved to find only calm, composed features staring back at her. Whatever storm brewed within her marriage, she intended to face this evening with the dignity befitting her position. "You look every inch a duchess, my lady," Alice said softly, securing a final pin into her carefully arranged hair. "Thank you, Alice." Elowen turned from the mirror, taking a steadying breath. "Let us hope the evening proves as elegant as its preparations suggest." Downstairs, the great hall had already begun filling with guests by the time Elowen descended the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister. Conversation buzzed throughout the room, punctuated by the gentle strains of a string quartet stationed near the far windows. She spotted Alaric near the entrance, greeting arriving guests with the practiced charm he reserved exclusively for public occasions, his dark formal attire making him appear every bit the powerful duke his title demanded. He glanced toward her as she approached, something unreadable flickering across his expression, before he offered his arm with practiced formality. "You look well, Elowen." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, matching his careful tone as she accepted his arm, falling into the familiar rhythm of performing contentment before watching eyes that had sustained them through countless smaller gatherings these past months. The early hours of the evening passed with surprising ease. Elowen moved gracefully among the guests, engaging in polite conversation, complimenting gowns, inquiring after children and estates with genuine warmth that had become second nature to her despite the private difficulties of her marriage. Several guests remarked upon how beautifully she managed the evening's arrangements, and for a brief, fragile moment, she allowed herself to feel something close to pride in what she had built within these walls, regardless of the coldness that persisted behind closed doors. That fragile peace shattered entirely sometime after midnight, when Alaric's mood, already darkened by several glasses of strong wine consumed throughout the evening, took a sharp and dangerous turn. Elowen had been standing near the refreshment tables, engaged in pleasant conversation with an elderly baroness, when she noticed her husband approaching with an unsteady gait that immediately concerned her. His eyes carried a glassy sheen she recognized from rare occasions, when his careful composure slipped beneath the weight of too much wine, and something in his expression, dark and simmering, sent a cold warning down her spine. "Elowen," he said, his voice carrying slightly louder than appropriate for the crowded room, several nearby guests turning their attention toward the sound. "Your Grace," she replied carefully, hoping to guide him toward a quieter corner, before whatever troubled him escalated further. "Perhaps we might speak privately." "Privately," he repeated, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "You are always so concerned with privacy, aren't you, my dear wife? Careful conversations behind closed doors, quiet confrontations in my study. And yet you had no concern for privacy when you approached Vivienne directly, embarrassing me before my own household staff." Several nearby guests had stopped their own conversations now, drawn by the rising tension in the Duke's voice, though Elowen desperately tried to steer the moment toward something less public. "Alaric, please. This is neither the time nor the place." "Is it not?" His laugh carried a harsh, unfamiliar edge. "You seem to have no difficulty finding the time or place to interfere in matters that do not concern you, Duchess. Why should I show more restraint discussing matters that concern us both?" A small crowd had begun gathering now, drawn by curiosity and the unmistakable tension crackling between the host and hostess of the evening's grand celebration. Elowen felt her cheeks burn with mounting horror as she recognized the direction this confrontation was heading, desperate to prevent the disaster she saw approaching. "Please," she whispered urgently, reaching for his arm. "Not here, Alaric. Whatever grievance troubles you, we can discuss it privately, away from our guests." He pulled his arm away sharply, his voice rising further, careless now of the growing audience surrounding them. "You wish to discuss things privately? How curious, given how eagerly you sought public confrontation with Vivian. Tell me, Elowen, did it satisfy something within you? Approaching her directly, playing the wronged wife before her. Did it feed whatever bitter resentment you carry toward a marriage you never wanted any more than I did?" "That is not fair," Elowen said, her voice trembling now despite her desperate effort to maintain composure before the growing crowd of watching guests, Lady Winslow among them, her expression alight with barely concealed delight at witnessing such a dramatic scene unfold. "Fair?" Alaric's voice cracked like a whip through the suddenly silent hall, the string quartet's music faltering, as the musicians themselves turned to watch the unfolding scene. "You speak to me of fairness, when you have done nothing since arriving at Thornwood, except make my life more difficult with your constant demands, your prying questions, your inability to simply accept the arrangement we both agreed to when we spoke our vows." "I have tried," Elowen said, her voice breaking now despite every effort to maintain her dignity before the crowd of watching faces. "I have tried everything within my power to make this marriage bearable, Alaric, while you have given me nothing but coldness and secrecy in return." "Bearable," he repeated, his voice thick with contempt now, wine and wounded pride overriding whatever restraint might have prevented this public catastrophe under different circumstances. "You wish to speak of what is bearable? Perhaps if you had been a proper wife, warm and welcoming rather than cold and suspicious from the very first day of our marriage, I would have found less reason to seek comfort elsewhere." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests at this cruel accusation, delivered so publicly, so devastatingly, before nearly 200 witnesses from across the county's noble families. Elowen felt her entire world narrow to this single, humiliating moment, her husband's cruel words hanging in the air like a physical blow, delivered before everyone whose respect she had worked so tirelessly to earn. "You blame me," she whispered, tears finally spilling, despite her fierce effort to contain them, "for your own choice to remain devoted to another woman throughout our entire marriage." "I blame you," Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly through the shocked silence of the great hall, "for a coldness that drove me toward comfort I could not find within my own home." The words struck Elowen like physical blows, each one landing before an audience that would carry this story throughout the county for months, perhaps years to come. She stood frozen, humiliation and heartbreak warring within her chest, acutely aware of every watching face, every whispered comment, already beginning to circulate among the guests closest to the unfolding scandal. Margaret appeared suddenly at her side, her expression carefully composed, despite the horror evident in her eyes, gently taking Elowen's arm. "My lady, perhaps some air would do you good." Elowen allowed herself to be guided away from the crowd, away from her husband's cruel accusations, away from the countless watching eyes that had witnessed her complete and total humiliation, before the very society she had worked so diligently to earn respect within. As Margaret led her toward a side corridor, away from the great hall's blazing lights and shocked silence, Elowen caught one final glimpse of Alaric, standing alone amid the stunned crowd, his expression already shifting from anger toward something that might have been regret, though the damage had already been done beyond any possibility of repair. Behind her, she heard Lady Winslow's voice, unable to resist commenting even in the aftermath of such devastating scandal. "Well," the sharp-tongued woman murmured to a companion, not troubling herself to lower her voice sufficiently, "I dare say, We shall be discussing this particular evening for quite some time." Elowen's tears fell freely now as Margaret guided her through quiet corridors toward the privacy of her own chamber, the distant sounds of the great hall slowly fading behind them, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence of complete and utter devastation. Whatever fragile hope she had carried into this marriage, whatever quiet dignity she had worked so tirelessly to maintain throughout months of coldness and secrecy, had just been shattered completely, before the watching eyes of the entire county, by the very man who had sworn before God and priest to honor and protect her. As Margaret settled her gently onto her bed, murmuring soft, comforting words that Elowen barely registered through her grief, she understood with sudden, devastating clarity that her marriage, whatever small chance it might once have had at finding peace, had just ended in the most public and humiliating manner imaginable. Whatever came next, she knew nothing would ever be the same again within the walls of Thornwood Manor. Downstairs, the great hall slowly emptied as guests departed in careful, subdued groups, murmuring quietly among themselves about the scandal they had just witnessed, already composing the stories they would carry back to their own estates. Alaric remained standing near the refreshment tables long after the last carriage rolled away down the frozen drive, staring at the wreckage of an evening that had begun with such promise and ended in such devastating ruin. Beatrice found him there sometime near dawn, still standing amid the remnants of decorations and half-finished glasses of wine, his expression hollow, with something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine regret. She said nothing, merely began quietly directing the remaining kitchen staff to clear away the debris of the ruined celebration, careful not to intrude upon whatever private reckoning occupied her master's troubled thoughts. Upstairs, Elowen lay awake long after Margaret had finally left her alone, staring at the ceiling of her grand chamber, replaying the humiliating scene over and over in her exhausted mind. She thought of every face in that crowd, every whispered comment, every gasp of shock that had greeted her husband's cruel accusations. She thought of Lady Winslow's barely concealed delight, of the countless stories that would now spread throughout the county, embellished and exaggerated with each retelling, until her name became synonymous with scandal and public humiliation. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little comfort, filled with fractured images of candle-lit faces and her husband's cold, contemptuous voice ringing through the great hall. She woke the following morning to gray winter light filtering through her curtains, her eyes swollen from the tears she had finally allowed herself the previous night. Alice entered quietly, her expression carefully neutral, though clearly aware of the scandal that had unfolded, and helped her mistress dress in simple, practical clothing, rather than the elaborate gowns typically expected of a duchess. "Has His Grace asked for me this morning?" Elowen asked quietly, dreading whatever conversation might await her. "No, my lady. He has remained in his study since early this morning. Margaret says he has not slept." Elowen said nothing further, though something cold settled in her stomach at the thought of facing her husband again, after the previous night's devastating scene. She spent the morning quietly in her chamber, unable to face the household staff who had witnessed, directly or through careful gossip, the complete unraveling of her marriage, before the entire county's watching eyes. It was nearly midday when Margaret appeared at her door, her expression carefully composed, though something troubled lingered behind her usually steady gaze. "My lady," Margaret said quietly, "His Grace requests your presence in his study." Elowen's heart sank at the summons, though she rose immediately, smoothing her simple gown, and steadying her breath before following Margaret through the quiet corridors, toward whatever conversation awaited her. She could not have known, as she walked those familiar hallways one final time, as a woman still uncertain of her place within these walls, that the words about to be spoken in that study would soon change the entire course of her life. Along the way, she passed Nora carrying a tray of untouched breakfast dishes back toward the kitchen, the young maid's eyes lowering respectfully as her mistress approached, though not before Elowen caught the flash of sympathy in her expression. Even the youngest members of the household staff understood, it seemed, that something irreversible had shifted within Thornwood's walls overnight. At the entrance to the study, Margaret paused, resting a gentle hand on Elowen's arm. "Whatever he says, my lady, remember your own worth. You have done nothing this household should be ashamed of." Elowen offered a small, grateful nod, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, finding Alaric standing near the same window where he had stood on the very first day of her arrival at Thornwood, his back turned toward her, his shoulders carrying a weight she had never seen him display before. "You asked for me," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. He turned slowly, and for a moment, Eowyn almost did not recognize the man before her. Gone was the cold composure she had grown accustomed to these past months. In its place stood someone hollow-eyed and exhausted, clearly shaken by the events of the previous evening in ways she had not expected. "Sit, please," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. Eowyn remained standing. "I would rather hear whatever you intend to say first, Your Grace." Something flickered across his tired features, perhaps disappointment, perhaps simple resignation. He nodded slowly and began to speak, his voice carrying none of the anger from the previous night, replaced instead by something quieter and far more difficult for Eowyn to interpret. "The county will speak of last night for months," Alaric said finally, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame, though pride still colored the edges of his words. "Every noble family within a day's ride witnessed our disgrace. I have received 3 messages already this morning from families quietly withdrawing their support for matters I had hoped to settle before the new year." "I am aware of the consequences," Eowyn replied evenly, though her heart pounded with uncertainty at where this conversation intended to lead. "I was present for the humiliation myself, Your Grace, in case you have forgotten." Alaric's jaw tightened at the sharpness in her voice, though he did not raise his own in response, some remnant of the previous night's regret still tempering his usual defensiveness. "I have decided," he said slowly, "that it would be best for both of us if you spent some time away from Thornwood. The cottage at Hollow Brook, on the northern edge of the estate, remains furnished and habitable. I believe some distance would allow tempers to cool and perhaps permit the county's gossip to settle before you return." Eowyn stared at him, understanding slowly dawning through her shock. "You are sending me away." "I am suggesting a temporary arrangement," Alaric said, though his eyes did not quite meet hers as he spoke the words. "For the benefit of us both." "For the benefit of us both," Eowyn repeated, bitterness creeping into her voice despite her effort to remain composed. "Or for the benefit of your reputation, and perhaps for the convenience of continuing certain visits without my presence complicating matters further." Alaric's expression darkened slightly, though he said nothing to deny the accusation, which told Eowyn everything she needed to know about his true motivations. "The arrangements have already been made," he continued instead, avoiding her pointed remark entirely. "A carriage will be ready within the hour. Margaret has packed what belongings you will need for the journey." "Within the hour," Eowyn echoed, disbelief washing over her at the swiftness of her banishment, clearly decided upon and arranged before she had even entered this room. "You did not think to discuss this with me first, before making all necessary preparations?" "I am discussing it with you now," Alaric said, though the hollowness in his voice suggested even he understood how weak the justification sounded. Eowyn felt something within her finally break completely, not from sorrow this time, but from a cold, clarifying anger that steadied rather than shattered her. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying a calm finality that seemed to surprise him. "If this is truly what you wish, I will not fight you on it. But understand that I go willingly, only because I recognize there is little left here worth fighting to remain within." She turned and left the study without waiting for his response, walking through the quiet corridors of Thornwood Manor, with her head held high despite the devastation churning within her chest. She found Margaret waiting near her chamber, a single modest trunk already packed and resting beside the door. "My lady," Margaret said softly, her expression carrying genuine sorrow, "I am so terribly sorry it has come to this." "It is not your doing, Margaret," Eowyn replied, managing a small, grateful smile despite everything. "You have shown me more kindness during my time here than my own husband ever has." Margaret helped her into a simple traveling cloak, her hands trembling slightly with what might have been suppressed emotion. "The cottage at Hollow Brook is modest, my lady, but it is warm, and the surrounding countryside is quite beautiful, particularly in the coming spring months. I have instructed a young woman named Charlotte, no relation to Lady Winslow, I assure you, to attend to your needs there. She is reliable and discreet." "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." The older woman's composure finally cracked slightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, as she embraced Elowen briefly, an unusual display of affection from a woman normally so reserved in her conduct. "Whatever comes, my lady, know that this household has grown to admire you deeply, whatever foolishness the master has shown these past months." Elowen descended the grand staircase for what felt like the final time, her single modest trunk carried behind her by a footman, feeling the weight of every servant's watching eyes as she crossed the entrance hall toward the waiting carriage. Alaric did not appear to see her off, remaining instead in his study. Whether from shame or simple avoidance, Elowen could not say, and found she no longer particularly cared to know. The carriage ride to Hollowbrook took nearly 2 hours, winding along narrow country roads through forests still blanketed in winter snow, past small farming villages where curious eyes watched the ducal carriage pass with evident interest. Elowen stared out the window throughout the journey, her mind churning through everything that had happened, the humiliation of the ball, the coldness of her husband's decision, the strange, hollow relief that came from finally being free of the constant tension that had defined her marriage since its very first day. The cottage itself, when the carriage finally arrived, proved smaller and more modest than she had expected, though undeniably charming in its simplicity. Built from warm gray stone, with a thatched roof, and small, cheerful windows, it sat nestled among bare winter trees, beside a narrow, half-frozen brook that gave the property its name. A young woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile waited near the front door as the carriage rolled to a stop. "Lady Bramwell," the young woman said, offering a respectful curtsy, "I am Charlotte. Margaret sent word ahead that you would be arriving today. Please, come inside, out of this cold." Elowen followed Charlotte into the cottage, finding its interior simple but comfortable, with a modest sitting room warmed by a crackling fire, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms tucked beneath the sloped ceiling upstairs. It was nothing like the grand, echoing halls of Thornwood Manor, and Elowen found herself unexpectedly grateful for the modest, human scale of her new surroundings. "This will suit me well, Charlotte," she said, settling into a simple wooden chair beside the fire. "Thank you for your hospitality." "Of course, my lady. Margaret told me you might wish for some quiet time to yourself. I will not trouble you unless you require something specific." Charlotte withdrew to the kitchen, leaving Elowen alone with her thoughts for the first time since the disastrous events of the previous evening. She sat quietly by the fire, watching flames dance and crackle, feeling the strange mixture of grief and relief that came with such an abrupt and humiliating exile. In the weeks that followed, Elowen settled into a quiet, simple rhythm at Hollowbrook, tending a small garden despite the lingering winter cold, walking along the frozen brook each morning, reading books from a modest collection Margaret had thoughtfully included among her belongings. She wrote careful letters to her mother, still omitting the full truth of her circumstances, unable to bear the thought of her family learning how publicly and completely her marriage had unraveled. Word occasionally reached her from Thornwood, carried by Charlotte during her regular visits to the nearby village for supplies, though Elowen tried not to dwell too heavily on news of the estate she had left behind. She learned that Vivian Ashcombe now visited Thornwood openly, no longer bothering with secrecy or discretion, now that Elowen's presence no longer complicated matters. She learned, too, that household staff spoke increasingly of tension within the manor, whispers of the golden-haired woman's demanding nature growing louder with each passing week. Elowen told herself she cared little for such news, that her time at Hollowbrook represented a fresh beginning rather than simple exile, an opportunity to rebuild her sense of self away from the constant humiliation of a marriage that had never truly welcomed her. Some days, walking along the frozen brook with the cold air biting at her cheeks, she almost believed it entirely. But some nights, alone in the modest bedroom beneath the cottage's sloped ceiling, she allowed herself to wonder what might have been, had circumstances allowed her husband to choose differently, had pride and duty not bound them both to a marriage neither had truly wanted from its very beginning. One particularly cold afternoon, nearly a month into her stay at Hollowbrook, Elowen ventured into the nearby village to accompany Charlotte on her weekly errands. The small market square bustled with activity despite the biting wind, farmers selling the last of their stored winter vegetables, a baker calling out prices for fresh bread, children chasing each other between the stalls with careless laughter that seemed almost foreign to Elowen's ears after months of tense silence within Thornwood's grand halls. At one modest stall, An elderly woman named Edith sold hand-knitted scarves and mittens, her weathered hands moving deftly as she worked, even while tending her customers. Elowen paused to admire a particularly beautiful scarf in deep blue wool, and Edith looked up with sharp, kind eyes that seemed to see more than most. "You are the lady staying at the Hollow Brook Cottage," Edith said, not quite a question. "The whole village has wondered about you. I imagine gossip travels quickly in small villages, just as it does in grand estates," Elowen replied with a small, wry smile. Edith chuckled softly. "Perhaps more honestly, my lady, if I may say so. Village folk have little patience for pretending things are other than what they are." She studied Elowen's face for a long moment. "You carry sadness in your eyes, though you hide it well. Whatever brought you here, I hope you find some peace during your stay." The simple kindness of the woman's words struck Elowen deeply, and she found herself purchasing the blue scarf, along with a pair of mittens for Charlotte, grateful for a moment of genuine, uncomplicated human connection after months of careful, guarded interactions within the manor's cold walls. As winter slowly began loosening its grip on the countryside, Elowen found herself drawn increasingly toward the modest garden behind the cottage, where Charlotte had shown her a small plot of turned earth that had once, apparently, produced vegetables and herbs for the cottage's previous occupants. Despite having no experience with gardening, having grown up with servants who managed such tasks, Elowen threw herself into learning the work with unexpected enthusiasm, consulting an old gardening book she found among the cottage's modest collection, and asking Edith at the village market for advice on which seeds might survive the last frosts of the season. "You seem happier here, my lady, if you do not mind my saying so," Charlotte observed one afternoon, watching Elowen carefully turn soil with a small trowel, her hands stained with dirt in a manner that would have horrified the household staff at Thornwood. Elowen paused, considering the observation honestly for the first time. "I believe I am, Charlotte, strange as that may sound, given the circumstances that brought me here. It does not sound strange to me, my lady. Sometimes distance from difficult things allows a person to remember who they were before those difficulties began." The words settled thoughtfully in Elowen's mind as she continued her work, watching the pale winter sun sink slowly toward the horizon beyond the frozen brook. She thought of the young woman who had arrived at Thornwood so many months earlier, hopeful despite her nervousness, believing kindness might grow where love had not yet been planted. That woman felt distant now, replaced by someone harder, perhaps, but also steadier, more certain of her own worth regardless of whether her husband recognized it. Word from Thornwood continued arriving occasionally through Charlotte's village visits, carried by servants who traveled between the estate and the surrounding villages for supplies and errands. Elowen learned that Vivian now spent considerable time at the manor, no longer confined to the discreet cottage near the eastern boundary, but installed instead in guest quarters within the main house itself. A development that apparently troubled several among the household staff who remained loyal to their absent duchess. She learned, too, that tensions had begun emerging between Alaric and his golden-haired companion, whispers of arguments, overheard by servants, of Vivian's growing demands for jewelry and fine clothing that seemed to exceed even what a mistress might reasonably expect. Elowen found herself surprised by how little satisfaction such news brought her, expecting perhaps some measure of vindication in learning that her husband's chosen companion proved less perfect than his devotion had once suggested, yet feeling instead only a quiet, distant curiosity about how the situation might eventually unfold. She did not yet know that events at Thornwood were already beginning to unfold in ways that would soon test her husband's careful composure, far more severely than any confrontation she herself had ever offered him. Nor did she know how dramatically her own quiet exile was about to change course in the months ahead. With Elowen gone from Thornwood, Vivian Ashcombe settled into the manor with a swiftness that surprised even the household staff, who had grown accustomed to her occasional secretive visits. Within days of the Duchess's departure, Vivian had claimed the finest guest chamber in the East Wing for her own, requested that her belongings be moved from her family's more modest estate, and began issuing instructions to the household staff, as though she already held the title Elowen had been forced to leave behind. Margaret watched these developments with carefully concealed disapproval, maintaining the professional composure that decades of service had taught her, even as her private loyalty remained firmly with the Duchess, who had shown genuine kindness toward the household these past months. She noted, with quiet precision, the way Vivian addressed the staff, sharp and demanding, where Elowen had always been patient and considerate. The way she rearranged furniture and altered menus without consultation. The way she seemed to view the entire estate as a prize now rightfully hers to command. She asks for silk sheets from the finest merchants in the capital, Beatrice muttered to Margaret one evening in the kitchen, her voice tight with barely restrained frustration, and complains that the kitchen's usual bread is not refined enough for her taste. Lady Elowen never once complained about anything we served her. Patience, Beatrice, Margaret replied quietly, though her own expression betrayed similar frustration. This situation cannot continue indefinitely. Even His Grace must eventually see clearly what the rest of us already recognize. Alaric, for his part, seemed initially content with the arrangement, relieved perhaps to finally have Vivian present openly within his home, rather than confined to secretive evening visits at the old cottage. He indulged her requests for new gowns and jewelry, arranged for a personal maid to attend exclusively to her needs, and spent long evenings in her company that he had never once offered his own lawful wife. But as weeks passed, cracks began appearing in this newfound arrangement, small at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. Vivian's demands grew more frequent and more extravagant, her patience with the estate's daily operations thinner with each passing week. She complained about the quality of the wine, the arrangement of the gardens, the punctuality of the household staff, criticisms that Elowen had never once voiced, despite far greater cause throughout her own difficult months at Thornwood. One particular evening, Alaric returned from a lengthy meeting with his estate manager to find Vivian in a state of considerable agitation, having apparently dismissed one of the longtime household servants over some perceived slight regarding the timing of afternoon tea. "You dismissed Nora?" Alaric asked, genuine surprise coloring his voice as he learned of the young maid's sudden departure. "She has served this household faithfully for years." "She was insolent," Vivian replied dismissively, examining her reflection in a hand mirror rather than meeting his gaze directly. "I will not tolerate disrespect from servants, Alaric. Whatever loyalty you believe they deserve." "This is not how matters are handled at Thornwood," Alaric said, a note of genuine concern creeping into his voice, for the first time since Vivian's arrival at the manor. "Household decisions of this nature require careful consideration, not impulsive dismissal." Vivian's expression hardened slightly, the careful sweetness she had maintained throughout their courtship beginning to slip. "I am mistress of this house now, Alaric. Whatever title your wife still technically holds. I believe I am entitled to manage the household as I see fit." Something uncomfortable flickered across Alaric's features at her words, though he said nothing further that evening, choosing instead to quietly reinstate Nora's position the following morning, an act that Vivian noticed and resented, though she said nothing directly about the matter. The incident proved merely the first of many such small conflicts that gradually revealed a side of Vivian's character that Alaric had never fully witnessed during their years of secretive, limited courtship, where their previous relationship had existed almost entirely within stolen hours and carefully arranged meetings, always brief, always romantic in their scarcity. Daily life together, at Thornwood, exposed dimensions of her personality that proved far less appealing than the fantasy he had cherished for so many years. She grew impatient with the estate's slower rural pace, complaining frequently of boredom and expressing increasing interest in traveling to the capital for extended periods, ideally accompanied by generous allowances for new gowns and jewelry befitting her elevated position. She showed little genuine interest in the estate's actual management, dismissing Alaric's occasional attempts to discuss tenant affairs or agricultural matters as tedious distractions beneath her attention. Perhaps most troubling, Alaric began noticing a pattern of correspondence, arriving for Vivian, from a merchant named William Hartley, a wealthy trader whose business ventures had grown considerably over recent years, through dealings in the capital's shipping trade. The letters arrived with increasing frequency, and Vivian always insisted upon reading them privately, her expression carefully composed whenever Alaric happened to notice their arrival. "Who is this Hartley fellow who writes to you so often?" Alaric finally asked one evening, unable to fully suppress the suspicion that had been quietly building within him for weeks. "An old family acquaintance," Vivian replied smoothly, though something in her tone suggested careful rehearsal rather than genuine spontaneity. "Nothing that need concern you, Alaric." He allowed the matter to rest, though the seed of doubt she had planted continued growing quietly within his mind over the following weeks. Nurtured by small inconsistencies he began noticing in her behavior, evenings when she claimed exhaustion and retired early only for household staff to later mention seeing lantern light burning late in her chamber, occasional slips in conversation about plans and arrangements that did not quite align with what she had previously told him. Margaret, meanwhile, continued observing quietly from her position of trusted authority within the household, gathering small pieces of information through the careful network of loyal staff who had served the family for years and felt increasingly uneasy about the direction their master's affairs had taken. She learned, through a young footman who had once worked briefly for the Hartley family before joining Thornwood's staff, that William Hartley possessed considerable wealth, but a reputation for questionable business dealings, and that rumors had circulated in certain circles suggesting his interest in wealthy widows and unhappily married noblewomen, whose fortunes might prove vulnerable to careful manipulation. She said nothing directly to Alaric about these suspicions, understanding that her position required discretion regardless of her personal loyalties, but she made careful note of everything she observed, sensing that circumstances at Thornwood were building toward some inevitable reckoning that would soon require careful, honest accounting from all involved parties. As winter finally began yielding to the first tentative signs of spring, the atmosphere within Thornwood Manor grew increasingly tense, Vivian's demands escalating alongside Alaric's quiet, growing unease. The golden promise of their long-anticipated union together revealing itself, day by day, as something far more complicated and far less satisfying than either had anticipated during their years of secretive, romanticized courtship. One afternoon, reviewing the estate's quarterly accounts alone in his study, Alaric found himself comparing, almost unwillingly, the careful, thoughtful improvements Elowen had implemented during her time managing the household against the disorder that had crept into daily operations since her departure. She had reorganized the tenant farming arrangements to everyone's benefit, negotiated fairer terms with local merchants, and maintained meticulous records that made his own review of estate finances considerably easier. Since her absence, several of these careful systems had begun quietly unraveling, servants uncertain who now held final authority over household decisions, tenant farmers growing frustrated by inconsistent communication regarding rents and repairs. He found an old ledger, still bearing Elowen's careful, precise handwriting in the margins, notes she had made regarding which tenant families required additional support during the harsh winter months, which local merchants offered the fairest prices for household supplies. Small observations that revealed a thoughtfulness and diligence he had never properly acknowledged during her time at Thornwood. Something uncomfortable stirred within his chest as he studied her careful notations, a feeling he did not immediately recognize as the first stirrings of genuine regret. That same evening, he encountered Vivian in the drawing room, engaged in an argument with one of the household maids over a minor matter of scheduling that Elowen would have resolved with a few calm words and gentle understanding. Watching Vivian's sharp, impatient dismissal of the young servant's concerns, Alaric felt a growing discomfort that he found increasingly difficult to ignore. "Must you speak to the staff so harshly?" he asked, once the maid had hurried away, clearly distressed by the encounter. "They must learn proper respect," Vivian replied dismissively, settling onto the sofa and calling for wine without further discussion of the matter. "Really, Alaric, I do not understand why you concern yourself so much with the feelings of servants." Her words struck him differently than they might have months earlier, before daily proximity had revealed dimensions of her character he had never witnessed during their years of brief, romantic encounters. He found himself thinking, with growing frequency, of how differently Elowen had always treated the household staff, with genuine warmth and consideration, rather than careless authority. Days later, a chance discovery would prove far more troubling than these accumulating small disappointments. While searching Vivian's writing desk for a piece of stationery he needed for estate correspondence, Alaric came across a bundle of letters tucked carefully beneath a stack of unused paper, all bearing the same familiar handwriting he had noticed on previous correspondence from the merchant William Hartley. He knew he should not read another person's private letters, understanding the violation such an act represented. But something in the careful way these particular letters had been hidden, tucked away rather than simply stored among her other correspondence, aroused a suspicion he found impossible to ignore. He unfolded the topmost letter, his eyes scanning quickly across its contents. The words he found there struck him with far greater force than any argument or disappointment he had experienced since Vivian's arrival at Thornwood. The letter spoke, in careful but unmistakable terms, of plans for a future together once certain financial matters had been properly arranged, of patience required only a little longer before circumstances at Thornwood could be fully exploited for their mutual benefit, of an affection between Vivian and this merchant that had apparently existed for considerably longer than Alaric had ever suspected. He sat frozen at her writing desk, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, understanding, slowly dawning through the shock of betrayal. Everything he had sacrificed for this woman, the humiliation of his own wife, the scandal that had spread throughout the county's noble families, the quiet unraveling of his household's careful order, all of it, apparently, in service of affections that had never been genuinely reserved for him alone. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to its hiding place, his mind racing as he considered how best to proceed. He would need proof beyond this single discovery, evidence sufficient to confront her directly, without risk of her simply denying everything and turning the situation back upon his own supposed jealousy or suspicion. Over the following days, Alaric began his own careful investigation, quietly questioning household staff about Vivian's correspondence and movements, discovering through Margaret's careful, discreet inquiries that Vivian had indeed been exchanging letters with William Hartley for considerably longer than their arrival at Thornwood, correspondence that had continued steadily even during her supposedly devoted years of secretive courtship with Alaric himself. He learned, too, through a groundskeeper who had once traveled to the capital on estate business, that Hartley's shipping ventures had recently suffered considerable financial losses that might explain a sudden, urgent interest in securing access to Thornwood's considerable wealth through whatever arrangement Vivian might be capable of negotiating on his behalf. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Vivian had never truly loved him, not in the way he had believed throughout their years of secretive romance. She had simply waited, patiently, for circumstances to align in her favor, using their long history together as leverage toward whatever wealth and status she might eventually extract from her position within Thornwood's household, all while maintaining a separate, perhaps far more genuine connection with a man whose financial troubles now made her presence at the manor considerably more valuable than mere sentiment could explain. Alaric spent that evening alone in his study, staring at the fire without truly seeing its flickering light, his mind consumed by a bitter, aching realization that the affection he had sacrificed so much to preserve had perhaps never existed in the form he had believed it did. He thought, unwillingly at first, then with growing uncomfortable frequency, of Elowen's quiet dignity throughout months of coldness and humiliation, of her careful management of a household that had begun quietly falling into disorder without her steady presence, of the honest, unflinching words she had spoken to him during their difficult confrontations, words that had demanded nothing more than basic respect and honesty, qualities he now realized he had never truly offered anyone within his own home. Neither he nor Vivian yet suspected how dramatically and completely this fragile arrangement was about to unravel, nor how thoroughly it would force Alaric to finally confront truths about his own heart that he had spent years carefully avoiding. Alaric decided he needed absolute certainty before confronting Vivian with what he had discovered. A woman capable of maintaining such careful deception for years would not crumble easily before mere suspicion, and he understood that any confrontation lacking undeniable proof would likely end with clever denials and turned accusations, leaving him no closer to the truth than before. He enlisted Margaret's careful assistance, trusting her discretion more completely than any other member of his household staff. Together, they devised a plan that required patience and careful observation rather than direct confrontation, watching Vivian's movements and correspondence over the following weeks with the quiet attention of hunters tracking careful prey. Margaret discovered, through her network of household contacts, that Vivian had begun making discreet inquiries about traveling to the capital, ostensibly to purchase new gowns for the coming social season, though the timing aligned suspiciously with William Hartley's own scheduled business there. A young stable hand mentioned overhearing Vivian instruct a private courier to deliver messages to an address Margaret recognized as belonging to Hartley's town residents, messages sent with unusual urgency and frequency, given the supposedly casual nature of their acquaintance. Alaric himself intercepted, with considerable discomfort at his own methods, a letter addressed to Vivian that arrived before she had the opportunity to collect it herself from the Morning Post. He justified the violation to himself as necessary given the stakes involved, both for his own dignity and for the future security of an estate he had spent his entire life protecting. The letter, when he finally read its contents alone in his study, confirmed every suspicion that had been building within him since his initial discovery weeks earlier. Hartley wrote plainly of his continued affection for Vivian, expressing growing impatience with the delays in whatever arrangement they had apparently discussed, referencing specific sums of money that suggested detailed prior conversations about extracting considerable wealth from Thornwood's resources before their eventual departure together. Most damning of all, the letter referenced a plan already partially in motion, involving the sale of certain valuable items from the estate that Vivian apparently had access to and authority over. Jewelry and heirlooms that had belonged to Alaric's late mother, pieces that carried both financial and deeply personal significance to the Thornwood family legacy. Alaric sat frozen at his desk for a long while after finishing the letter, feeling something within him harden into cold, clarifying resolve. Whatever affection he had once believed existed between himself and Vivian, whatever years of secretive courtship he had cherished as genuine and meaningful, all of it had apparently been calculated deception, in service of ambitions that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with wealth and opportunity. He thought, with sudden and startling clarity, of Elowen standing before him in this very study, demanding honesty rather than comfortable illusions, insisting upon respect rather than convenient arrangement. He had dismissed her words as inconvenient truths he preferred not to confront, choosing instead the comfortable fantasy of a love he believed had survived years of separation and duty. Now, faced with the reality of Vivian's true intentions, he understood with painful clarity exactly how thoroughly he had misjudged both women involved in this devastating situation. That evening, he confronted Vivian directly in the drawing room, the intercepted letter resting on the table between them, exactly as Elowen had once presented her own damning evidence months earlier. An uncomfortable symmetry that was not lost on Alaric even in his anger. "I found this among the Morning Post," he said, his voice carrying a cold, controlled fury that surprised even himself. "Perhaps you might explain its contents." Vivian's composure flickered for only a moment before she recovered, though her eyes betrayed genuine alarm as she recognized the letter's significance. "Alaric, this is not what it appears to be." "Then explain what it does appear to be," he replied, his voice sharp with barely restrained anger. "Explain how a man you claim is merely a family acquaintance writes to you of plans and arrangements involving my mother's jewelry, of sums of money that suggest careful calculation regarding what wealth you might extract from this estate before departing with him entirely." "You do not understand the full situation," Vivian said, her earlier confidence beginning to crack under the weight of his direct accusation. "Then explain it to me," Alaric demanded. "Explain how the woman I sacrificed everything for, humiliated my own wife for, destroyed my reputation throughout this entire county for, has apparently been planning her departure with another man's wealth, long before circumstances brought us together within these walls." Vivian's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions: alarm, calculation, and finally, something approaching genuine desperation, as she recognized the impossibility of maintaining her careful deception any longer. "William and I share a complicated history," she admitted finally, her voice losing its practiced sweetness. "His business ventures suffered significant losses recently. He required assistance securing new capital, and she paused, seeming to search for words that might soften the damning truth. "I offered to help however I could. By stealing from my family's legacy," Alaric said flatly. "I never intended for things to unfold so dramatically," Vivian protested, though her words carried little genuine conviction. "William and I have known each other for years, long before you and I ever became involved. Our arrangement was simply meant to be practical, nothing more." "And your affection for me?" Alaric asked, his voice quiet now, though no less cutting for its restraint. "Was that simply practical as well?" Vivian hesitated, and that hesitation told Alaric everything he needed to know, with painful, final clarity. "I did care for you, Alaric, in my own way," she said finally, though the qualification itself confirmed the deeper truth he had already suspected. "But circumstances required practical considerations as well. William's financial troubles created opportunities that I could not simply ignore. Opportunities, Alaric repeated bitterly. You mean opportunities to extract wealth from a household I welcomed you into, from a marriage I destroyed for your sake, from a family legacy I have spent my entire life protecting. Vivian said nothing further, her silence itself a confirmation of everything Alaric had already discovered through his careful investigation. He rose from his chair, his expression hardening into something cold and final. You will leave Thornwood by morning, he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. I will not pursue legal consequences for what you have already attempted, given the complications such action would create for my own reputation. But you will take nothing from this estate beyond what you arrived with, and you will never set foot within these walls again. Alaric, Vivian said, something desperate creeping into her voice, now that her careful schemes lay fully exposed. Surely, we can discuss this more reasonably. There is nothing left to discuss, he replied, turning away from her with a finality that echoed through the quiet drawing room. You have taken everything from me that you were capable of taking, save perhaps my dignity, which I foolishly surrendered entirely on my own account. She left as instructed the following morning, her departure witnessed by household staff, who had grown increasingly weary of her demanding presence, though none among them dared express open satisfaction, given the somber mood that had settled over their master since the previous evening's devastating confrontation. Alone once again in his study, Alaric found himself confronting truths he had spent years carefully avoiding, understanding with painful, growing clarity exactly how thoroughly his own pride and stubborn devotion to a fantasy of lost love had cost him everything genuinely valuable within his own life. He thought of Elowen's quiet strength throughout months of humiliation and coldness, of her careful management of a household that had fallen into disorder without her steady guidance, of the honest, unflinching demands she had made for basic respect and dignity that he had so thoroughly failed to provide. He understood, with sudden and overwhelming certainty, that whatever affection he had once believed reserved exclusively for Vivian had been built upon foundations far less substantial than the quiet, steady partnership Elowen had offered him from the very beginning of their arranged marriage, a partnership he had dismissed and humiliated without ever truly recognizing its worth. Sitting alone in his darkened study long into the evening, Alaric began to understand, for the first time since his marriage began, exactly what he had lost through his own foolish pride and misplaced devotion, and exactly what he now needed to do to attempt any possibility of setting matters right. Margaret found him there near midnight, still seated at his desk, the fire long since burned down to quiet embers. She entered quietly, carrying a small tray with tea. She suspected he would not drink, more an excuse to check upon him than genuine expectation he required refreshment. Your Grace, she said softly, setting the tray down carefully, you have been sitting here alone for many hours. I have been thinking, Margaret, he replied, his voice hollow with exhaustion and regret, thinking about how thoroughly I have failed everyone who ever placed trust in me, my mother's legacy, this household's stability, and most of all, my own wife. Margaret said nothing immediately, allowing the silence to settle naturally between them, though her expression carried something almost like cautious hope, the first she had permitted herself to feel since witnessing the disastrous events of the winter ball months earlier. May I speak plainly, Your Grace? She asked finally. Please. Lady Elowen never once complained during her time here, despite considerable provocation that would have justified far greater bitterness than she ever displayed. She managed this household with genuine care for every person within it, from the highest guest to the lowest kitchen maid. She asked for nothing beyond basic honesty and respect, qualities that should have come easily within any marriage, arranged or otherwise. Margaret paused, choosing her next words carefully. I have served this family for over 20 years, Your Grace, and I have never witnessed a woman more deserving of a husband's genuine devotion, nor one who received so little of it in return. Alaric absorbed her words in silence, feeling their truth settle uncomfortably within his chest. I do not know if she would ever forgive me, Margaret, even if I found the courage to ask. Perhaps not, Margaret acknowledged honestly, but I believe, Your Grace, that you owe her the attempt, regardless of whatever outcome might follow. She deserves, at minimum, honest acknowledgement of the wrongs done against her, whatever she chooses to do with that acknowledgement afterward. Alaric nodded slowly, something resolving within him, despite the uncertainty that still clouded his thoughts. "I will need to consider carefully how best to approach her," he said. "After everything I have done, mere words will accomplish little without genuine, demonstrated change behind them." "Wisdom, at last, Your Grace," Margaret said, allowing herself a small, cautious smile, despite the gravity of the conversation. "Might I suggest patience as well? Whatever wounds you have caused will not heal quickly, regardless of how genuine your intentions prove to be." Over the following days, Alaric threw himself into restoring order to a household that had drifted during Vivienne's brief, chaotic residence. He personally apologized to Nora for her earlier dismissal, ensuring her position remained secure regardless of any future household changes. He reviewed the estate's finances carefully, discovering with relief that Vivienne's schemes had been discovered before any irreversible damage occurred to the family's considerable wealth or his mother's cherished heirlooms. He spent long hours studying Elowen's careful notations in the old household ledgers, beginning to understand more fully the genuine talent and dedication she had brought to managing an estate that had never properly welcomed or appreciated her efforts. He also began, cautiously, inquiring about conditions at Hollow Brook, learning through Margaret's discreet correspondence with young Charlotte that Elowen had settled into a quiet, simple routine there, tending a small garden, walking regularly along the frozen brook, maintaining polite but understandably guarded relationships with the local villagers who had welcomed her presence. Learning of her apparent contentment, however modest, brought Alaric a strange mixture of relief and renewed guilt. Relief that she had found some measure of peace, despite everything he had put her through, and guilt at recognizing how completely his own actions had driven her towards seeking such peace, entirely apart from the marriage and household she had once hoped to build alongside him. He understood that any attempt at reconciliation would require considerable patience and genuine demonstrated change, not merely apologetic words that cost him nothing beyond momentary discomfort. He began planning carefully, considering how best to approach a woman he had wronged so thoroughly and so publicly, understanding that whatever path toward forgiveness might exist would require far more from him than simple regret, however genuine that regret had finally become. As spring settled fully over the countryside surrounding Thornwood, green shoots pushing through soil that had remained frozen for so many long winter months, Alaric found himself standing at the same window where he had first met Elowen so many months earlier, remembering her nervous determination on that distant morning, her quiet dignity throughout months of humiliation and coldness that followed. He resolved, finally and completely, that he would not allow pride to prevent him from attempting whatever might still be possible between them, regardless of how difficult or uncertain that attempt might prove to be in the weeks ahead. Alaric rode alone to Hollow Brook on a clear spring morning, choosing to travel by horse rather than carriage, feeling that the 2-hour journey required some measure of physical effort matching the difficulty of what he intended to say once he arrived. The countryside had transformed considerably since Elowen's departure months earlier, bare winter trees now budding with new green leaves, fields that had lain frozen and empty, now showing the first tender shoots of spring planting. He arrived at the cottage sometime near midday, his horse's hooves crunching softly against the gravel path leading toward the modest stone building beside its narrow brook. He dismounted slowly, taking a steadying breath before approaching the front door, uncertain what reception awaited him after months of silence and separation. Charlotte answered his knock, her expression flickering with evident surprise at finding the Duke himself standing at the cottage door. "Your Grace," she said, offering a hasty curtsy, "I was not informed of your visit." "I apologize for the lack of notice," Alaric said, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding authority, replaced instead by something quieter and more uncertain. "Is Lady Elowen available? I would very much like to speak with her, if she is willing." Charlotte hesitated, clearly uncertain how to proceed, given the circumstances she understood only partially. "Please wait here, Your Grace. I will inform her of your arrival." She disappeared into the cottage, leaving Alaric standing alone at the threshold, his heart pounding with an uncertainty he rarely permitted himself to feel. Several long minutes passed before Charlotte returned, her expression carefully neutral. "Lady Elowen will see you, Your Grace, though she asks that you understand her time is limited this afternoon." Alaric nodded, understanding the deliberate coolness behind such a statement, and followed Charlotte inside toward the cottage's modest sitting room, where Elowen stood waiting near the window, her posture composed but guarded, nothing like the nervous, hopeful young woman he had first met so many months earlier. She had changed during her months away from Thornwood, he noticed immediately. Her cheeks carried healthy color from time spent outdoors, her expression steadier and more certain than he remembered, as though the distance from his household had allowed her to reclaim some fundamental strength that his own coldness had gradually eroded during their time together. "Alaric," she said simply, neither warmth nor hostility coloring her tone, merely careful, measured acknowledgement. "Elowen." He found himself uncertain how to proceed, despite having rehearsed this conversation countless times during his journey. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I confess I am curious what brings you here after so many months of silence," she said, gesturing toward a simple wooden chair near the fire, though she herself remained standing near the window, maintaining careful distance between them. Alaric remained standing as well, feeling that sitting comfortably would suggest a familiarity he had not yet earned. "I have come to apologize," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "For the ball, for sending you away, for every cruelty I inflicted upon you throughout our entire marriage." Elowen studied him carefully, her expression revealing little of her private thoughts. "Apologies are easily spoken, Alaric. I have learned, through considerable painful experience, that words alone rarely translate into meaningful change." "I understand your skepticism," Alaric said, "and I do not ask you to simply accept my apology without proof of genuine change behind it, but I felt I owed you, at minimum, honest acknowledgement of everything I did wrong." "Very well," Elowen said, her voice carrying careful neutrality. "What, specifically, do you acknowledge?" Alaric took a steadying breath, understanding she intended to hold him fully accountable, rather than accepting vague, general apologies. "I acknowledge that I humiliated you publicly, before the entire county's watching eyes, blaming you for my own choices, rather than accepting responsibility for the pain my continued devotion to Vivian caused throughout our marriage. As I acknowledge that I sent you away not for your benefit, as I claimed at the time, but for my own convenience, so that I might continue that relationship without your presence complicating matters. I acknowledge that I never once gave you the basic respect and honesty you deserved as my wife, choosing instead coldness and secrecy at every opportunity." Elowen remained silent for a long moment, absorbing his words carefully. "And Vivienne?" she asked finally. "What has become of your devotion toward her?" She revealed herself to be someone quite different from the woman I believed I loved for so many years, Alaric said, his voice carrying genuine bitterness now. "She was planning, throughout her entire time at Thornwood, to extract wealth from my family's legacy, in service of an arrangement with another man entirely, a merchant whose financial troubles apparently made my household's resources considerably attractive to her calculating ambitions." "I see," Elowen said quietly, though something in her expression suggested she felt little satisfaction in learning of Vivienne's betrayal, understanding perhaps better than anyone the particular pain of discovering that someone's affection had never been genuinely reserved for oneself. "I understand now," Alaric continued, "that whatever affection I believed existed between myself and Vivienne was built upon fantasy and years of romanticized separation, rather than the genuine partnership and mutual respect that a real marriage requires. I understand, far too late, that you offered me exactly that genuine partnership from the very first day of our marriage, and I repaid your efforts with nothing but coldness and cruelty." Elowen turned away from him slightly, staring out the window toward the garden she had cultivated with such careful attention throughout the spring months. "You speak beautifully of understanding now, Alaric. But understanding arrived only after your fantasy collapsed on its own, revealing itself as unworthy of the sacrifice you made for it. I wonder whether you would have ever arrived at this same understanding had Vivienne's schemes remained undiscovered." The observation struck him with uncomfortable accuracy, and he found himself unable to immediately refute it. "Perhaps you are right to doubt my sincerity," he admitted finally. "I can offer you no proof beyond time and demonstrated action that my regret is genuine, rather than merely convenient, given how circumstances have unfolded." "Then perhaps that is exactly what you should offer," Elowen said, turning back to face him directly, her expression steady, despite whatever emotion churned beneath her careful composure. "Time and demonstrated action, rather than words spoken in a moment of convenient regret. "What would you have me do?" Alaric asked, genuine uncertainty coloring his voice, for perhaps the first time in their entire acquaintance. Elowen considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not know, Alaric, whether anything can genuinely repair what has been broken between us. I have built a quiet peace here at Hollowbrook, difficult as it was initially to accept my exile. I am not certain I wish to surrender that peace for uncertain promises of change that may or may not prove genuine over time." "I understand your hesitation," Alaric said quietly. "I do not ask you to return to Thornwood immediately, nor do I ask you to simply forgive everything that has passed between us. I ask only for the opportunity to demonstrate, through consistent action rather than convenient words, that I am capable of becoming the husband you deserved from the very beginning of our marriage." Elowen studied him for a long, silent moment, weighing his words carefully against months of accumulated hurt and disappointment. "You have caused considerable pain throughout our marriage, pain that will not simply disappear because you now recognize the value of what you nearly destroyed. I do not expect ease," he replied. "I expect only the chance to prove, over whatever time you require, that genuine change is possible." "Very well," Elowen said finally, though her tone carried careful caution rather than warm acceptance. "You may visit occasionally, Alaric, and we shall see whether your actions match the acknowledgement you have offered today. But understand clearly that I make no promises beyond this single opportunity for you to demonstrate whatever change you claim now motivates you." Alaric nodded, understanding the significant concession this represented, given everything he had put her through. "Thank you, Elowen. I do not take this opportunity lightly." Before he departed, Elowen walked him to the door, her earlier careful composure softening slightly, though she remained guarded against too much hope. At the threshold, Alaric paused, turning back to face her once more. "There is one more thing I wish to say," he said quietly. "I found the old household ledgers, the ones you maintained during your time managing Thornwood, your notations regarding the tenant families, the careful arrangements with local merchants, the thoughtful attention you paid to matters I never once properly acknowledged. I want you to know that I saw them, truly saw them, for the first time since your departure, and I understood then how thoroughly I failed to appreciate the genuine gift you brought to that household." Elowen's composure flickered slightly at his words, something vulnerable crossing her expression, before she carefully smoothed it away again. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. "It means more than you perhaps realize." "I intend to keep those systems in place," Alaric continued, "regardless of whatever happens between us personally. The tenant families deserve the fair treatment you established for them, and the household deserves the careful order you brought to it." "That is good to hear," Elowen replied, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her careful guard, the first he had seen from her since his arrival that morning. He mounted his horse and rode away from Hollowbrook as the afternoon light began softening toward evening, feeling a strange mixture of relief and continued uncertainty about what lay ahead. He had not expected forgiveness, not truly, understanding that months of accumulated hurt could not simply dissolve after a single conversation, however honest. But he had received something perhaps more valuable than immediate forgiveness. A single, cautious opportunity to demonstrate genuine change through consistent action rather than convenient words. Inside the cottage, Elowen remained standing near the window long after his horse had disappeared down the gravel path, watching the empty road with an expression that mixed careful hope against months of hardened self-protection. Charlotte entered quietly, having witnessed enough of the conversation's ending to understand something significant had shifted between her mistress and the Duke. "My lady," she said gently, "are you well?" "I am uncertain, Charlotte," Elowen admitted honestly, turning from the window at last. "I do not know whether to trust what I witnessed today, or whether I am simply allowing foolish hope to cloud my better judgment once again." "Perhaps time will reveal which is true," Charlotte offered gently. "You need not decide everything at once, my lady." Elowen nodded slowly, grateful for the young woman's steady presence throughout her months of quiet exile. "You are right, Charlotte. Time will reveal the truth of his intentions, one way or another." That evening, as she sat by the fire, working at embroidery that had become a familiar comfort during her time at Hollowbrook, Elowen allowed herself to consider, cautiously, what genuine change from Alaric might actually look like, and whether she possessed sufficient strength to risk her hard-won peace on the uncertain possibility that her husband had truly transformed into someone capable of offering the respect and honesty she had always deserved. She did not yet know how consistently and genuinely Alaric intended to pursue this second chance, nor how thoroughly the coming months would test both his resolve and her own careful, guarded hope. But something within her, small and cautious though it remained, had shifted that afternoon, opening a door she had believed permanently closed since the humiliating night of the winter ball, months earlier. As she prepared for bed that night, Eowyn found herself thinking, for the first time in many months, not of the pain her marriage had caused her, but of the small, genuine acknowledgement Alaric had offered regarding her careful management of the household, of the sincere regret that had colored his voice throughout their entire difficult conversation. Whatever came next, she understood that the path toward reconciliation, should it prove possible at all, would require patience and careful observation on her part, watching closely whether Alaric's actions in the weeks ahead would genuinely match the humble words he had spoken that afternoon at Hollowbrook. True to his word, Alaric began visiting Hollowbrook regularly over the following weeks, though he never presumed upon Eowyn's careful hospitality by staying longer than she seemed comfortable permitting. He arrived without prior announcement most times, understanding that formal notice would suggest a performance staged for her benefit rather than genuine, consistent effort offered regardless of whether she witnessed it directly. On his second visit, he arrived to find the cottage's modest roof suffering from a considerable leak that Charlotte had mentioned troubled them during recent spring rains. Rather than simply arranging for workmen to address the problem, as his position and wealth would have easily allowed, Alaric removed his fine coat, borrowed simple tools from a nearby farmer, and spent the entire afternoon repairing the thatching himself, his hands growing rough and calloused in ways they had never experienced during his privileged life, managing Thornwood's considerable estate. Eowyn watched from the garden, saying little throughout the afternoon, though she noted with quiet surprise the genuine effort he invested in work that required no witnesses to validate its sincerity. When he finally climbed down from the roof, as evening approached, exhausted and covered in dust, she offered him a simple meal of bread and stew, rather than the formal courtesy she had maintained during his first visit. "You did not need to do that yourself," she observed, as they sat together at the small kitchen table, an arrangement that would have seemed unthinkable, given their respective positions, just months earlier. "I wanted to," Alaric replied simply. "I have spent my entire life directing others to perform necessary work, understanding little of what such labor actually requires. I thought perhaps I might learn something valuable through the experience."
"And did you?" He considered the question seriously before answering.
"I learned that genuine effort requires more patience and humility than I previously possessed, qualities I clearly failed to demonstrate throughout much of our marriage." Eowyn said nothing further on the matter, though something in her expression suggested his answer had earned a small measure of genuine respect she had not expected to offer so soon. Over the following months, Alaric's visits continued, with steady, reliable consistency, never demanding more attention than Eowyn seemed willing to offer, never pressing for reconciliation faster than her careful, guarded trust could accommodate. He brought no elaborate gifts, understanding instinctively that expensive jewelry or fine gowns would suggest he still believed material wealth might substitute for genuine emotional repair. Instead, he brought small, thoughtful offerings, seeds for her garden that Edith at the village market had recommended, books he thought might interest her, based on careful attention to conversations they shared during his visits, practical assistance with tasks around the modest cottage that required an extra pair of hands. He also began, gradually, sharing more of himself than he ever had during their earlier marriage, speaking honestly about his difficult relationship with his late mother, whose demanding expectations had shaped much of his emotional guardedness throughout his adult life. He spoke of his genuine confusion and grief following Vivian's betrayal, not seeking sympathy, but offering honest vulnerability that stood in stark contrast to the careful emotional walls he had maintained throughout their entire earlier marriage. Eowyn, for her part, found herself gradually lowering some of her own careful guard, though she remained cautious about fully trusting the transformation she witnessed developing before her. She spoke honestly about the pain his earlier coldness had caused her, about the humiliation of the winter ball that still occasionally visited her thoughts during quiet evening hours, about the difficult journey toward rebuilding her own sense of self-worth during the months of exile at Hollowbrook. "I do not know if I can simply return to how things were," she admitted, during one particular visit, as they walked together along the frozen brook that had long since thawed into gentle, flowing water beneath the warming spring sunshine. "Too much has happened, Alaric, for me to simply pretend the past year never occurred." "I do not ask you to pretend anything," he replied honestly. "I ask only that you allow me the continued opportunity to demonstrate whatever genuine change I am capable of achieving, regardless of how long that process requires." Word of their gradual reconciliation eventually reached Thornwood's household staff, carried through the careful correspondence Margaret maintained with Charlotte throughout these developing months. Margaret received the news with quiet, cautious hope, understanding better than most within the household exactly how thoroughly Alaric needed to prove his genuine transformation before Eowyn could reasonably risk her hard-won peace and independence on the possibility of a restored marriage. One particular afternoon, arriving at Hollowbrook to find Eowyn struggling with a stubborn root system while attempting to expand her garden's modest boundaries, Alaric spent several hours working alongside her in comfortable, companionable silence, neither of them needing to fill every moment with careful conversation, as they had during earlier visits. When they finally paused to rest, sharing simple bread and cheese beneath the shade of a nearby tree, Eowyn found herself studying him with an expression that carried genuine, unguarded warmth, for perhaps the first time since their earliest days of marriage. "You have changed, Alaric," she said finally, breaking their comfortable silence. "Truly changed. Not merely performed change for my benefit." "I hope so," he replied honestly. "Losing everything I believed I valued taught me lessons I should have learned far earlier in my life. I am grateful, strange as it may sound, for the painful clarity that experience eventually provided." "I am glad you found that clarity," Eowyn said softly. "Though I confess, I wish it had not required such considerable pain, for both of us, to arrive at this particular understanding." "As do I," Alaric agreed quietly. "I cannot undo the pain I caused you throughout our earlier marriage, Eowyn. I can only continue demonstrating, through whatever time and patience you require, that I am capable of becoming the husband you deserved from the very beginning." As summer approached, bringing warmth and abundant growth to the countryside surrounding Hollowbrook, Eowyn found herself increasingly comfortable in Alaric's steady, consistent presence during his regular visits. The careful guard she had maintained throughout the early months of their reconciliation gradually softened into something approaching genuine trust, built not upon grand romantic gestures or elaborate promises, but upon the accumulated weight of countless small, consistent actions that demonstrated far more meaningful transformation than words alone could ever have achieved. She did not yet know whether she was prepared to return fully to Thornwood, to reclaim her position as Duchess, before the same county society that had witnessed her humiliating exile. A test of this fragile, rebuilding trust arrived unexpectedly one afternoon in early summer, when Alaric mentioned, almost in passing during one of his regular visits, that he had received a letter from Lady Winslow requesting his presence at a small gathering the following week. Eowyn's expression tightened slightly at the mention of the woman who had so gleefully witnessed her public humiliation months earlier. "Will you attend?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, though tension had crept into her posture. "I have already sent my regrets," Alaric replied without hesitation. "I have no interest in social gatherings hosted by a woman who took such evident pleasure in your suffering. My priority remains here, earning back whatever trust I am capable of rebuilding with you, not maintaining appearances before a society whose opinion matters considerably less to me than it once did." Something in his immediate, unhesitating answer settled a portion of Eowyn's remaining doubt, understanding that his priorities had genuinely shifted, rather than merely adjusting temporarily for her benefit during these visits. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. "You need not thank me for simple honesty, Eowyn. I owe you considerably more than that, after everything you endured throughout our marriage." Another significant moment arrived several weeks later, when Alaric invited Eowyn to visit Thornwood itself for the first time since her exile, not to reclaim her position immediately, he explained carefully, but simply to see for herself the changes he had implemented throughout the household during her absence. Elowen hesitated considerably before accepting, uncertain whether she possessed sufficient emotional strength to face the grand halls where her most painful humiliation had occurred. Charlotte accompanied her for the journey, providing quiet, steady support throughout the carriage ride that retraced the same road Elowen had traveled many months earlier during her difficult exile. Arriving at Thornwood's familiar iron gates, Elowen felt her heart pounding, with a complicated mixture of old grief and cautious curiosity, as the towering manor came into view once again. Margaret greeted her at the entrance with genuine warmth that brought unexpected tears to Elowen's eyes, the older woman's careful composure finally breaking as she embraced her former mistress with obvious affection. "My lady, it does my heart good to see you again within these walls." Walking through the familiar corridors, Elowen noticed immediately the careful order that had been restored throughout the household. The same systems she had established during her earlier time managing the estate, now maintained with evident attention and respect. Nora greeted her warmly, along with several other members of staff, who had clearly missed her steady, considerate presence throughout the household's daily operations. "His Grace has kept everything exactly as you arranged it, my lady," Margaret explained, as they walked together through the manor's grand halls. "He consulted your old ledgers extensively when reorganizing the tenant arrangements after Lady Ashcomb's departure, and he has continued your practice of personally reviewing conditions among the estate's farming families each season." Elowen absorbed this information with quiet surprise, understanding more fully the genuine extent of Alaric's transformation during her months of absence. When they reached the great hall where the disastrous winter ball had unfolded, she paused, old memories washing over her with unexpected intensity, despite the months that had passed since that devastating evening. Alaric found her there, standing quietly, amid the same space where he had once humiliated her so completely, before the county's assembled nobility. "I know this room carries difficult memories," he said quietly, approaching carefully. "I considered whether inviting you here again might cause more harm than good." "I am glad you did invite me," Elowen replied, surprising herself with the honesty of her own response. "I needed to see this place again, to understand that its power over my memories need not remain as absolute as I once believed." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the grand hall's tall windows filling the space with warm summer sunlight, quite different from the candlelit tension of that devastating winter evening. "I have thought often," Alaric said finally, "about what I might have done differently that night, had I possessed even a fraction of the wisdom I have since gained through such painful experience." "We cannot undo the past, Alaric," Elowen said gently. "We can only choose, carefully and deliberately, what we build going forward." "Then let us build carefully," he replied, "and deliberately, exactly as you say." As the visit concluded, and Elowen prepared to return to Hollowbrook that evening, she found herself considering, for the first time, with genuine seriousness, the possibility of eventually returning to Thornwood permanently, not as the nervous, hopeful bride who had first arrived at these gates so long ago, nor as the humiliated, exiled wife who had departed in disgrace, but as a woman who had rebuilt her own strength and dignity through considerable difficulty, now considering whether a genuinely transformed partnership might finally be possible with the husband who had caused her so much earlier pain. She did not make any final decision that evening, understanding that such an important choice deserved careful, unhurried consideration, rather than impulsive response to a single positive visit. But as her carriage rolled away from Thornwood's familiar gates, watching the grand manor gradually disappear behind the summer countryside, Elowen felt, for the first time in many months, something approaching genuine hope for whatever future might still be possible between herself and the husband who had finally begun to understand her true worth. Summer deepened over the countryside surrounding both Thornwood and Hollowbrook, bringing with it a gradual, steady transformation in the relationship between Elowen and Alaric that neither had quite anticipated when their difficult reconciliation first began months earlier. What had started as cautious, guarded visits had grown into something considerably more meaningful, built patiently through countless small moments of genuine honesty and consistent, demonstrated respect. Elowen found herself visiting Thornwood with increasing frequency throughout these summer months, no longer requiring Charlotte's steady support to face the manor's familiar halls, discovering instead a growing comfort in reconnecting with household staff who had genuinely missed her presence, and in witnessing firsthand the continued care Alaric invested in maintaining the careful systems she had originally established throughout the estate. One particular afternoon, walking together through the gardens where roses had bloomed abundantly throughout the warm summer weather, Alaric paused beside the same stone bench where Margaret had once gently explained to Eowyn the painful truth about Vivian's continued presence in her husband's affections so many difficult months earlier. "I have been considering something important," Alaric said, his voice carrying a nervous uncertainty that seemed almost unfamiliar, coming from a man who had once commanded every room he entered with effortless authority. "I would like to formally ask whether you might consider returning to Thornwood permanently, not merely for occasional visits, but as my wife, in every genuine sense of the word." Eowyn studied him carefully, understanding the significance of this moment, after so many months of careful, patient rebuilding. "I have been considering the same question myself," she admitted honestly, "though I confess, certain concerns continue troubling my thoughts." "Please, tell me what concerns you," Alaric said, settling onto the bench beside her, rather than standing above her as he might have during their earlier, more formal marriage. "I worry about facing the county's society again," Eowyn said honestly. "The humiliation of that winter ball has not entirely faded from memory, and I know Lady Winslow and others will certainly remember exactly what transpired that evening, regardless of whatever genuine changes have occurred since." "I understand that concern," Alaric replied thoughtfully. "I have given considerable thought to how we might address it, should you choose to return. I believe we should host another gathering at Thornwood, not immediately, but once you feel genuinely prepared for such an event. This time, however, I intend to speak publicly and honestly about my earlier failures, acknowledging directly before our neighbors exactly how thoroughly I wronged you, and how much I have come to value the genuine partnership you offered me from the very beginning of our marriage." Eowyn absorbed this suggestion with quiet surprise, understanding the considerable vulnerability such a public acknowledgement would require from a man who had always guarded his pride so carefully. "That would require considerable courage, Alaric. I have learned, through everything that has happened this past year, that genuine courage matters considerably more than the false pride I once mistook for strength," he replied. "I am prepared to make whatever public acknowledgement might help restore your dignity before the same society that witnessed its earlier destruction, if that is what you require to feel genuinely secure in returning to Thornwood." Eowyn felt something within her finally settle into peaceful certainty, understanding that this offer, more than any other gesture throughout their months of careful reconciliation, represented genuine transformation rather than convenient performance. Ready to return to Thornwood, and ready to face whatever society continues to whisper about our difficult history, provided we face it together, honestly and openly. They spent the following weeks preparing carefully for Eowyn's permanent return, and for the gathering Alaric intended to host, in acknowledgement of his earlier failures. Margaret assisted enthusiastically with preparations, genuine joy evident in her careful management of details that would ensure this particular event unfolded quite differently from the disastrous winter ball that had occurred so many months earlier. When the evening finally arrived, guests gathered once again in Thornwood's great hall, many of the same faces who had witnessed the original scandal now present to witness whatever might unfold this time. Lady Winslow arrived with evident curiosity, clearly anticipating fresh gossip regardless of the occasion's stated purpose, celebrating the Duke and Duchess's renewed partnership. Alaric rose before the assembled guests, once conversation had settled into attentive quiet. Eowyn standing beside him, with careful composure, despite the nervous anticipation she felt at facing this same society again after so many difficult months. "Many of you witnessed, several months ago, a devastating scene within this very hall," Alaric began, his voice carrying genuine humility rather than his once practiced charm. "I spoke cruel, unfair words to my wife that evening, blaming her for failures that were entirely my own responsibility. I had allowed misplaced devotion to a relationship built upon fantasy, rather than genuine affection, to poison what should have been a partnership built upon honesty and mutual respect." A hushed silence settled over the assembled guests, several exchanging surprised glances at such an unexpectedly direct and vulnerable admission from a man known throughout the county for his careful, guarded composure. "I sent my wife away that same winter," Alaric continued, not for her benefit, as I claimed at the time, but for my own convenience. I have since learned, through considerable painful experience, exactly how thoroughly I misjudged both the woman I wrongly pursued and the woman I so carelessly wronged. He turned to face Elowen directly, his expression carrying genuine emotion he made no effort to conceal before their watching audience. Elowen showed more strength, dignity, and genuine partnership throughout our difficult marriage than I ever deserved or properly recognized. I am grateful, more than I can adequately express, that she has offered me the opportunity to demonstrate genuine change, and I intend to spend the remainder of our marriage proving worthy of the trust she has so generously extended toward me. The room remained quiet for a long moment before scattered applause began, gradually building into genuine warmth as guests recognized the considerable courage such public acknowledgement required. Even Lady Winslow, whatever gossip she might have anticipated, appeared genuinely moved by the sincerity evident throughout Alaric's careful words. Elowen felt tears gathering in her eyes, though these carried none of the earlier humiliation and grief that had once accompanied similar tears within this same hall. Instead, she felt genuine joy and a profound sense of vindication after months of careful, patient work toward rebuilding something authentic between herself and her husband. "Thank you, Alaric," she said quietly, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "for finally showing this county, and more importantly, showing me, the genuine man I always hoped you might become." As the evening continued, music filling the great hall with warmth, quite different from the tense silence of that earlier winter gathering, Elowen and Alaric danced together before their assembled guests, their movements carrying genuine affection that had been entirely absent throughout their earlier, difficult marriage. Margaret watched from near the entrance, quiet satisfaction evident in her expression, as she witnessed the culmination of months spent quietly hoping for exactly this outcome. In the months and years that followed, Thornwood Manor gradually transformed into a household genuinely defined by warmth and mutual respect, rather than the cold formality that had characterized its earlier years under Alaric's guarded, distant management. Elowen resumed her careful stewardship of the estate's daily affairs, now working alongside her husband rather than in isolated silence, their partnership growing steadily stronger through continued honest communication and shared commitment to the household and tenant families they both genuinely cared for. Vivian Ashcombe, they eventually learned through occasional county gossip, had indeed departed for the capital alongside William Hartley, though their arrangement apparently unraveled within a year, once his financial troubles proved beyond even her calculating assistance to resolve, leaving them both to face considerably diminished circumstances that neither had anticipated when their scheme first began. Elowen thought of Vivian only rarely in the years that followed, understanding that whatever pain the other woman had once caused throughout her marriage had ultimately led toward a partnership with Alaric considerably stronger and more genuine than anything that might have developed had circumstances unfolded differently. She had learned, through considerable difficulty, that genuine love required patience, honesty, and consistent demonstrated respect, qualities that could not be commanded into existence through arrangement or duty alone, but which could, given sufficient time and genuine effort, grow steadily between two people willing to face their failures honestly and work diligently toward authentic partnership. On quiet evenings, walking together through the same gardens where their difficult reconciliation had first taken root, Elowen and Alaric often found themselves reflecting on the painful journey that had ultimately led them toward genuine happiness, understanding that whatever challenges the future might still bring, they now faced them together, as true partners bound not merely by arrangement or duty, but by hard-won, authentic love. A year after that transformative summer gathering, Elowen gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Rose, in honor of the gardens that had witnessed so much of their careful, patient rebuilding. Alaric proved a devoted father from the very first moment he held his daughter, a warmth and tenderness evident in his manner that stood in stark contrast to the guarded, distant man Elowen had first married so many years earlier. Margaret, now considerably older, but still faithfully serving the household she had watched transform so completely, often remarked to Beatrice and the younger staff about how thoroughly their master and mistress had grown throughout their difficult years together, holding up their eventual partnership as proof that genuine change remained possible even after the most painful beginnings. Charlotte, who had accompanied Elowen back to Thornwood, following her permanent return, remained in service to the family for many years afterward, often recalling with quiet pride the months she had spent supporting her mistress through the difficult exile at Hollowbrook, understanding that she had witnessed, firsthand, the quiet strength and dignity that had ultimately earned Elowen the genuine partnership she had always deserved. Occasionally, on particularly reflective evenings, Elowen would walk alone through the modest garden at Hollowbrook, which she and Alaric had chosen to maintain rather than abandon entirely, a quiet retreat they visited together several times each year, remembering the difficult but transformative period when she had rebuilt her own sense of self-worth, entirely apart from the marriage that had once caused her such considerable pain. "Do you ever regret those months of exile?" Alaric asked her once, as they sat together beside the cottage's familiar hearth during one such visit, their young daughter sleeping peacefully in a cradle nearby. Elowen considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "I regret the pain that led to my exile, certainly," she said. "But I do not regret the strength I discovered during those difficult months alone. I learned, through that painful experience, exactly what I was capable of enduring, and exactly what I deserved from any partnership I chose to build going forward. Without that difficult period of growth, I am uncertain whether I would have possessed sufficient wisdom to recognize genuine change when you finally offered it." Alaric reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own. "I am grateful, then, for whatever difficult path led us both toward the understanding we now share, however painful that journey proved to be along the way." "As am I," Elowen agreed softly, watching the fire crackle gently within the modest hearth that had once provided her only comfort during her loneliest, most uncertain months. "Whatever difficulties brought us here, I would not trade the genuine partnership we have built together for any easier path that might have avoided such painful lessons." Years later, when their daughter Rose had grown old enough to ask about her parents' early years of marriage, curious about faded portraits and old household stories she occasionally overheard from longtime staff members, Elowen would tell her, with careful honesty, that even the most difficult beginnings could eventually transform into genuine happiness, provided both partners remained willing to acknowledge their failures honestly and work patiently toward authentic change. "Your father was not always the man you know today," she would explain gently, choosing her words carefully to convey truth without unnecessary bitterness. "We both had to learn, through considerable difficulty, what genuine love actually required: patience, honesty, and consistent respect that cannot be commanded into existence through mere arrangement or duty alone. But love, given sufficient time and genuine effort, can grow even from the most unlikely and painful beginnings, becoming something far stronger and more meaningful than anyone might have originally believed possible." And so the story of Thornwood Manor, once defined by scandal, humiliation, and painful betrayal, gradually transformed into a testament to the possibility of genuine change and authentic partnership, remembered throughout the county, not for the devastating winter ball that had once threatened to destroy an entire marriage, but for the quiet, patient courage that had ultimately rebuilt something far more valuable than either Duke or Duchess had ever believed possible during those earlier, painful years of misunderstanding and heartbreak.